The Ant and the Grasshopper by William Somerset Maugham. When I was a very small boy, I was made to learn by heart certain of the fables of La Fontaine, and the moral of each was carefully explained to me. Among those I learnt was The Ant and the Grasshopper, which is devised to bring home to the young the useful lesson that in an imperfect world industry is rewarded and giddiness punished. In this admirable fable, I apologize for telling something which everyone is politely but inexactly supposed to know. The ant spends a laborious summer gathering its winter store, while the grasshopper sits on a blade of grass singing to the sun. Winter comes and the ant is comfortably provided for, but the grasshopper has an empty larder. He goes to the ant and begs for a little food. Then the ant gives him her classic answer. "What were you doing in the summertime?" "Saving your presents. I sang all day, all night." "You sang? Why, then go and dance." I do not ascribe it to perversity on my part, but rather to the inconsequence of childhood, which is deficient in moral sense, that I could never quite reconcile myself to the lesson. My sympathies were with the grasshopper, and for some time I never saw an ant without putting my foot on it. In this summary, and as I have discovered since entirely human fashion, I sought to express my disapproval of prudence and common sense. I could not help thinking of this fable when, the other day, I saw George Ramsay lunching by himself in a restaurant. I never saw anyone wear an expression of such deep gloom. He was staring into space. He looked as though the burden of the whole world sat on his shoulders. I was sorry for him. I suspected at once that his unfortunate brother had been causing trouble again. I went up to him and held out my hand. "How are you?" I asked. "I'm not in hilarious spirits," he answered. "Is it Tom again?" He sighed. "Yes, it's Tom again." "Why don't you chuck him? You've done everything in the world for him. You must know by now that he's quite hopeless." I suppose every family has a black sheep. Tom had been a sore trial to his for 20 years. He had begun life decently enough. He went into business, married, and had 2 children. The Ramsays were perfectly respectable people, and there was every reason to suppose that Tom Ramsay would have a useful and honourable career. But one day, without warning, he announced that he didn't like work, and that he wasn't suited for marriage. He wanted to enjoy himself. He would listen to no expostulations. He left his wife and his office. He had a little money, and he spent 2 happy years in the various capitals of Europe. Rumours of his doings reached his relations from time to time, and they were profoundly shocked. He certainly had a very good time. They shook their heads and asked what would happen when his money was spent. They soon found out. He borrowed. He was charming and unscrupulous. I have never met anyone to whom it was more difficult to refuse a loan. He made a steady income from his friends, and he made friends easily. But he always said that the money you spent on necessities was boring. The money that was amusing to spend was the money you spent on luxuries. For this he depended on his brother George. He did not waste his charm on him. George was a serious man, and insensible to such enticements. George was respectable. Once or twice he fell to Tom's promises of amendment, and gave him considerable sums in order that he might make a fresh start. On these Tom bought a motor car and some very nice jewellery. But when circumstances forced George to realize that his brother would never settle down, and he washed his hands of him, Tom, without a qualm, began to blackmail him. It was not very nice for a respectable lawyer to find his brother shaking cocktails behind the bar of his favorite restaurant, or to see him waiting on the box seat of a taxi outside his club. Tom said that to serve in a bar or to drive a taxi was a perfectly decent occupation, but if George could oblige him with a couple of £100, he didn't mind for the honour of the family giving it up. George paid. Once Tom nearly went to prison. George was terribly upset. He went into the whole discreditable affair. Really, Tom had gone too far. He had been wild, thoughtless, and selfish, but he had never before done anything dishonest, by which George meant illegal, and if he were prosecuted, he would assuredly be convicted. But you cannot allow your only brother to go to jail. The man Tom had cheated, a man called Cronshaw, was vindictive. He was determined to take the matter into court. He said Tom was a scoundrel and should be punished. It cost George an infinite deal of trouble and £500 to settle the affair. I have never seen him in such a rage as when he heard that Tom and Cronshaw had gone off together to Monte Carlo the moment they cashed the cheque. They spent a happy month there. For 20 years Tom raced and gambled, philandered with the prettiest girls, danced, ate in the most expensive restaurants, and dressed beautifully. He always looked as if he had just stepped out of a bandbox. Though he was 46, you would never have taken him for more than 35. He was a most amusing companion, and though you knew he was perfectly worthless, you could not but enjoy his society. He had high spirits, an unfailing gaiety, and incredible charm. I never grudged the contributions he regularly levied on me for the necessities of his existence. I never lent him £50 without feeling that I was in his debt. Tom Ramsay knew everyone, and everyone knew Tom Ramsay. You could not approve of him, but you could not help liking him. Poor George, only a year older than his scapegrace brother, looked 60. He had never taken more than a fortnight's holiday in the year for a quarter of a century. He was in his office every morning at 9:30 and never left it till 6. He was honest, industrious, and worthy. He had a good wife to whom he had never been unfaithful even in thought, and 4 daughters to whom he was the best of fathers. He made a point of saving 1/3 of his income, and his plan was to retire at 55 to a little house in the country where he proposed to cultivate his garden and play golf. His life was blameless. He was glad that he was growing old, because Tom was growing old too. He rubbed his hands and said, "It was all very well when Tom was young and good-looking, but he's only a year younger than I am. In 4 years he'll be 50. He won't find life so easy then. I shall have £30,000 by the time I'm 50. For 25 years I've said that Tom would end in the gutter, and we shall see how he likes that. We shall see if it really pays best to work or be idle." Poor George. I sympathized with him. I wondered now, as I sat down beside him, what infamous thing Tom had done. George was evidently very much upset. "Do you know what's happened now?" he asked me. I was prepared for the worst. I wondered if Tom had got into the hands of the police at last. George could hardly bring himself to speak. "You're not going to deny that all my life I've been hard-working, decent, respectable, and straightforward. After a life of industry and thrift, I can look forward to retiring on a small income in gilt-edged securities. I've always done my duty in that state of life in which it has pleased Providence to place me." "True. And you can't deny that Tom has been an idle, worthless, dissolute, and dishonourable rogue. If there were any justice, he'd be in the workhouse." "True." George grew red in the face. "A few weeks ago he became engaged to a woman old enough to be his mother, and now she's died and left him everything she had. £500,000, a yacht, a house in London, and a house in the country." George Ramsay beat his clenched fist on the table. "It's not fair, I tell you. It's not fair. Damn it. It's not fair." I could not help it. I burst into a shout of laughter as I looked at George's wrathful face. I rolled in my chair. I very nearly fell on the floor. George never forgave me, but Tom often asks me to excellent dinners in his charming house in Mayfair, and if he occasionally borrows a trifle from me, that is merely from force of habit. It is never more than a sovereign.
French Joe by William Somerset Maugham. It was Captain Bartlett who told me of him. I do not think that many people have been to Thursday Island. It is in the Torres Straits, and is so called because it was discovered on a Thursday by Captain Cook. I went there since they told me in Sydney that it was the last place God ever made. They said there was nothing to see, and warned me that I should probably get my throat cut. I had come up from Sydney in a Japanese tramp, and they put me ashore in a small boat. It was the middle of the night, and there was not a soul on the jetty. One of the sailors who landed my kit told me that if I turned to the left, I should presently come to a 2-story building, and this was the hotel. The boat pushed off, and I was left alone. I do not much like being separated from my luggage, but I like still less to pass the night on a jetty and sleep on hard stones. So I shouldered a bag and set out. It was pitch dark. I seemed to walk much more than a few hundred yards, which they had spoken of, and was afraid I had missed my way, but at last saw dimly a building which seemed to be important enough to suggest that it might be the hotel. No light showed, but my eyes by now were pretty well accustomed to the darkness, and I found a door. I struck a match, but could see no bell. I knocked. There was no reply. I knocked again, with my stick, as loudly as I could. Then a window above me was opened, and a woman's voice asked me what I wanted. "I've just got off the Shikamaru," I said. "Can I have a room?"
"I'll come down."
I waited a little longer, and the door was opened by a woman in a red flannel dressing-gown. Her hair was hanging over her shoulders in long black wisps. In her hand she held a paraffin lamp. She greeted me warmly, a little stoutish woman with keen eyes and a nose suspiciously red, and bade me come in. She took me upstairs and showed me a room.
"Now you sit down," she said, "and I'll make up the bed before you can say Jack Robinson. What will you have? A drop of whisky would do you good, I should think. You don't want to be washing at this time of night. I'll bring you a towel in the morning."
And while she made the bed, she asked me who I was and what I had come to Thursday Island for. She could see I wasn't a seafaring man. All the pilots came to this hotel, and had done for 20 years, and she didn't know what business could have brought me. I wasn't that fellow as was coming to inspect the customs, was I? She'd heard they were sending someone from Sydney. I asked her if there were any pilots staying there then. Yes, there was one, Captain Bartlett. Did I know him? A queer fish he was, and no mistake. Hadn't got a hair on his head, but the way he could put his liquor away, well, it was a caution. There the bed was ready, and she expected I'd sleep like a top, and one thing she could say was the sheets were clean. She lit the end of a candle and bade me good night. Captain Bartlett certainly was a queer fish, but he is of no moment to my present purpose. I made his acquaintance at dinner next day. Before I left Thursday Island I had eaten turtle soup so often that I have ceased to look upon it as a luxury. and it was because in the course of conversation I mentioned that I spoke French that he asked me to go and see French Joe.
It'll be a treat to the old fellow to talk his own lingo for a bit. He's 93, you know.
For the last 2 years, not because he was ill, but because he was old and destitute, he had lived in the hospital, and it was here that I visited him. He was lying in bed, in flannel pyjamas much too large for him, a little shriveled old man with vivacious eyes, a short white beard, and bushy black eyebrows. He was glad to speak French with me, which he spoke with the marked accent of his native isle, for he was a Corsican, but he had dwelt so many years among English-speaking people that he no longer spoke his mother tongue with accuracy. He used English words as though they were French, making verbs of them with French terminations. He talked very quickly, with broad gestures, and his voice for the most part was clear and strong, but now and then it seemed suddenly to fade away, so that it sounded as though he spoke from the grave. The hushed and hollow sound gave me an eerie feeling. Indeed, I could not look upon him still as of this world. His real name was Joseph de Pauli. He was a nobleman and a gentleman. He was of the same family as the general we have all read of in Boswell's Johnson, but he showed no interest in his famous ancestor.
"We have had so many generals in our family,"
he said.
"You know, of course, that Napoleon Bonaparte was a connection of mine. No, I have never read Boswell. I have not read books. I have lived."
He had entered the French army in 1851, 75 years ago. It is terrifying. As a lieutenant of artillery, like my cousin Bonaparte, he said, he had fought the Russians in the Crimea, and as a captain the Prussians in 1870. He showed me a scar on his bald pate from an Uhlans lance, and then with a dramatic gesture told how he had thrust his sword in the Uhlan's body with such violence that he could not withdraw it. The Uhlan fell dead, and the sword remained in the body. But the Empire perished, and he joined the Communists. For 6 weeks he fought against the government troops under Monsieur Thiers. To me, Thiers is but a shadowy figure, and it was startling, and even a trifle comic, to hear French Joe speak with passionate hatred of a man who has been dead for half a century. His voice rose into a shrill scream as he repeated the insults, oriental in their imagery, which in the council he had flung at the head of this mediocre statesman. French Joe was tried and sentenced to 5 years in New Caledonia.
"They should have shot me,"
he said.
"But dirty cowards, they dared not."
Then came the long journey in a sailing vessel, and the antipodes, and his wrath flamed out again when he spoke of the indignity thrust upon him, a political prisoner, when they herded him with vulgar criminals. The ship put in at Melbourne, and one of the officers, a fellow Corsican, enabled him to slip over the side. He swam ashore, and, taking his friend's advice, went straight to the police station. No one there could understand a word he said, but an interpreter was sent for. His dripping papers were examined, and he was told that, so long as he did not set foot on a French ship, he was safe.
"Freedom!"
he cried to me.
"Freedom!"
Then came a long series of adventures. He cooked, taught French, swept streets, worked in the gold mines, tramped, starved, and at last found his way to New Guinea. Here he underwent the most astonishing of his experiences, for drifting into the savage interior, and they are cannibals there still, after 100 desperate adventures and hairbreadth escapes, he made himself king of some wild tribe.
"Look at me, my friend,"
he said.
"I, who lie here on a hospital bed, the object of charity, have been monarch of all I surveyed.
Yes, it is something to say that I have been a king.
But eventually he came into collision with the British, and his sovereignty passed from him. He fled the country and started life once more. It is clear that he was a fellow of resource, for eventually he came to own a fleet of pearling luggers on Thursday Island. It looked as though, at last, he had reached a haven of peace, and, an elderly man now, he looked forward to a prosperous and even respectable old age. A hurricane destroyed his boats, and ruin fell upon him. He never recovered. He was too old to make a fresh start, and since then had earned as best he could a precarious livelihood, till at last, beaten, he had accepted the hospital's kindly shelter. But why did you not go back to France or Corsica? An amnesty was granted to the communists a quarter of a century ago.
What are France and Corsica to me after 50 years? A cousin of mine seized my land. We Corsicans never forget and never forgive. If I had gone back, I should have tried to kill him. He had his children.
Funny old French Joe,
smiled the hospital nurse, who stood at the end of the bed. At all events, you have had a fine life, I said.
Never. I have had a frightful life. Misfortune has followed me wherever I turn my steps, and look at me now. I am rotten, fit for nothing but the grave. I thank God that I had no children to inherit the curse that is upon me.
Why, Joe, I thought you didn't believe in God,
said the nurse.
It is true. I am a skeptic. I have never seen a sign that there is, in the scheme of things, an intelligent purpose. If the universe is the contrivance of some being, that being can only be a criminal imbecile.
He shrugged his shoulders.
Anyhow, I have not got much longer in this filthy world, and then I shall go and see for myself what is the real truth of the whole business.
The nurse told me it was time to leave the old man, and I took his hand to bid him farewell. I asked him if there was anything I could do for him.
I want nothing,
he said.
I only want to die.
His black, shining eyes twinkled.
But meanwhile, I should be grateful for a pack of cigarettes.
The Man with the Scar by William Somerset Maugham. It was on account of the scar that I first noticed him, for it ran broad and red in a great crescent from his temple to his chin. It must have been due to a formidable wound, and I wondered whether this had been caused by a sabre or by a fragment of shell. It was unexpected on that round, fat, and good-humoured face. He had small and undistinguished features, and his expression was artless. His face went oddly with his corpulent body. He was a powerful man of more than common height. I never saw him in anything but a very shabby grey suit, a khaki shirt, and a battered sombrero. He was far from clean. He used to come into the Palace Hotel at Guatemala City every day at cocktail time, and strolling leisurely round the bar, offer lottery tickets for sale. If this was the way he made his living, it must have been a poor one, for I never saw anyone buy. But now and then I saw him offered a drink. He never refused it. He threaded his way among the tables with a sort of rolling walk, as though he were accustomed to traverse long distances on foot, paused at each table, with a little smile, mentioned the numbers he had for sale, and then, when no notice was taken of him, with the same smile, passed on. I think he was, for the most part, a trifle the worse for liquor. I was standing at the bar one evening, my foot on the rail, with an acquaintance. They make a very good dry martini at the Palace Hotel in Guatemala City, when the man with the scar came up. I shook my head, as for the 20th time since my arrival he held out for my inspection his lottery tickets. But my companion nodded affably. "¿Qué tal, General? How is life?" "Not so bad. Business is none too good, but it might be worse." "What will you have, General?" "A brandy." He tossed it down and put the glass back on the bar. He nodded to my acquaintance. "Gracias. Hasta luego." Then he turned away and offered his tickets to the men who were standing next to us. "Who is your friend?" I asked. "That's a terrific scar on his face." "It doesn't add to his beauty, does it? He's an exile from Nicaragua. He's a ruffian, of course, and a bandit, but not a bad fellow. I gave him a few pesos now and then. He was a revolutionary general, and if his ammunition hadn't given out, he'd have upset the government and be Minister of War now, instead of selling lottery tickets in Guatemala. They captured him along with his staff, such as it was, and tried him by court-martial. Such things are rather summary in these countries, you know, and he was sentenced to be shot at dawn. I guess he knew what was coming to him when he was caught. He spent the night in jail, and he and the others, there were 5 of them altogether, passed the time playing poker. They used matches for chips. He told me he'd never had such a run of bad luck in his life. They were playing with a short pack, jacks to open, but he never held a card. He never improved more than 6 times in the whole sitting, and no sooner did he buy a new stack than he lost it. When day broke and the soldiers came into the cell to fetch them for execution, he had lost more matches than a reasonable man could use in a lifetime. They were led into the patio of the jail and placed against a wall, the 5 of them, side by side, with the firing party facing them. There was a pause, and our friend asked the officer in charge of them what the devil they were keeping him waiting for. The officer said that the general commanding the government troops wished to attend the execution, and they waited for his arrival. "Then I have time to smoke another cigarette," said our friend. He was always unpunctual. But he had barely lit it when the general, it was San Ignacio, by the way, I don't know whether you ever met him, followed by his ADC, came into the patio. The usual formalities were performed, and San Ignacio asked the condemned men whether there was anything they wished before the execution took place. 4 of the 5 shook their heads, but our friend spoke. "Yes, I should like to say goodbye to my wife." "Bueno," said the general. "I have no objection to that. Where is she?" "She is waiting at the prison door." "Then it will not cause a delay of more than 5 minutes." "Hardly that, Senor General," said our friend. "Have him placed on one side." 2 soldiers advanced, and between them the condemned rebel walked to the spot indicated. The officer in command of the firing squad, on a nod from the general, gave an order. There was a ragged report, and the 4 men fell. They fell strangely, not together, but one after the other, with movements that were almost grotesque, as though they were puppets in a toy theatre. The officer went up to them, and into one, who was still alive, emptied 2 barrels of his revolver. Our friend finished his cigarette and threw away the stub. There was a little stir at the gateway. A woman came into the patio with quick steps, and then, her hand on her heart, stopped suddenly. She gave a cry, and with outstretched arms ran forward. "Caramba," said the general. She was in black, with a veil over her hair, and her face was dead white. She was hardly more than a girl, a slim creature, with little regular features and enormous eyes, but they were distraught with anguish. Her loveliness was such that as she ran, her mouth slightly open, and the agony of her face beautiful. A gasp of surprise was wrung from those indifferent soldiers who looked at her. The rebel advanced a step or two to meet her. She flung herself into his arms, and with a hoarse cry of passion, "Alma de mi corazón, soul of my heart," he pressed his lips to hers. And at the same moment he drew a knife from his ragged shirt. I haven't a notion how he managed to retain possession of it, and stabbed her in the neck. The blood spurted from the cut vein and dyed his shirt. Then he flung his arms round her and once more pressed his lips to hers. It happened so quickly that many did not know what had occurred, but from the others burst a cry of horror. They sprang forward and seized him. They loosened his grip, and the girl would have fallen if the ADC had not caught her. She was unconscious. They laid her on the ground, and with dismay on their faces stood round watching her. The rebel knew where he was striking, and it was impossible to staunch the blood. In a moment the ADC, who had been kneeling by her side, rose. "She's dead," he whispered. The rebel crossed himself. "Why did you do it?" asked the general. "I loved her." A sort of sigh passed through those men crowded together, and they looked with strange faces at the murderer. The general stared at him for a while in silence. "It was a noble gesture," he said at last. "I cannot execute this man. Take my car and have him led to the frontier. Senor, I offer you the homage which is due from one brave man to another." A murmur of approbation broke from those who listened. The ADC tapped the rebel on the shoulder, and between the two soldiers, without a word, he marched to the waiting car. My friend stopped, and for a little I was silent. I must explain that he was a Guatemaltecan, and spoke to me in Spanish. I have translated what he told me as well as I could, but I have made no attempt to tone down his rather high-flown language. To tell the truth, I think it suits the story. "But how, then, did he get the scar?" I asked at length. "Oh, that was due to a bottle that burst when I was opening it. A bottle of ginger ale." "I never liked it," said I.
The Poet by William Somerset Maugham. I am not much interested in the celebrated, and I have never had patience with the passion that afflicts so many to shake hands with the great ones of the earth. When it is proposed to me to meet some person distinguished above his fellows by his rank or his attainments, I seek for a civil excuse that may enable me to avoid the honor. And when my friend Diego Torre suggested giving me an introduction to Santa Aña, I declined. But for once the excuse I made was sincere. Santa Aña was not only a great poet, but also a romantic figure, and it would have amused me to see in his decrepitude a man whose adventures, in Spain at least, were legendary. But I knew that he was old and ill, and I could not believe that it would be anything but a nuisance to him to meet a stranger and a foreigner. Calixto de Santa Aña was the last descendant of the Grand School. In a world unsympathetic to Byronism, he had led a Byronic existence, and he had narrated his hazardous life in a series of poems that had brought him a fame unknown to his contemporaries. I am no judge of their value, for I read them first when I was 23, and then I was enraptured by them. They had a passion,
a heroic arrogance and a multicolored vitality that swept me off my feet, and to this day so intermingled are those ringing lines and haunting cadences with the charming memories of my youth, I cannot read them without a beating heart. I am inclined to think that Callisto de Santa Aña deserves the reputation he enjoys among the Spanish-speaking peoples. In those days his verses were on the lips of all young men, and my friends would talk to me endlessly of his wild ways, his vehement speeches, for he was a politician as well as a poet, his incisive wit, and his amours. He was a rebel, and sometimes an outlaw, daring and adventurous. But above all, he was a lover. We knew all about his passion for this great actress or that divine singer. Had we not read till we knew them by heart the burning sonnets in which he described his love, his anguish, and his wrath? And we were aware that an Infanta of Spain, the proudest descendant of the Bourbons, having yielded to his entreaties, had taken the veil when he ceased to love her. When the Philips, her royal ancestors, tired of a mistress, she entered a convent, for it was unfitting that one whom their king had loved should be loved by another. And was not Callisto de Santa Aña greater than any earthly king? We applauded the lady's romantic gesture. It was creditable to her and flattering to our poet. But all this took place many years ago, and for a quarter of a century Don Callisto, disdainfully withdrawing from a world that had nothing more to offer, had lived in seclusion in his native town of Silla. It was when I announced my intention of going there — I had been spending a week or two in Seville, not because of him, but because it is a charming little Andalusian town with associations that endear it to me — that Diego Torre offered me this introduction. It appeared that Don Callisto allowed the younger men of letters occasionally to visit him, and now and then would talk to them with the fire that had electrified his hearers in the great days of his prime. "What does he look like now?" I asked. "Magnificent." "Have you a photograph of him?" "I wish I had. He has refused to face the camera since he was 35. He says he does not wish posterity to know him other than young." I confess that I found this suggestion of vanity not a little touching. I knew that in early manhood he was of extraordinary beauty, and that moving sonnet of his, written when he grew conscious that youth had for ever left him, shows with what a bitter and sardonic pang he must have watched the passing of those looks that had been so fantastically admired. But I refused my friend's offer. I was quite satisfied to read once more the poems I had known so well, and for the rest I preferred to wander about the silent and sun-swept streets of Silla in freedom. It was with some consternation, therefore, that on the evening of my arrival I received a note from the great man himself. Diego Torre had written to him of my visit, he said, and it would give him great pleasure if I would call on him at 11 next morning. In the circumstances there was nothing for me to do but to present myself at his house at the appointed hour. My hotel was in the plaza, and on that spring morning it was animated, but as soon as I left it I might have walked in a deserted city. The streets, the tortuous white streets, were empty but for a woman in black now and then who returned with measured steps from her devotions. Silla is a town of churches, and you can seldom go far without seeing a crumbling facade or a tower in which storks have built their nests. Once I paused to watch a string of little donkeys pass by. Their red caparisons were faded, and they carried I know not what in their panniers. But Silla has been a place of consequence in its day, and many of these white houses have gateways of stone, surmounted by imposing coats of arms. For to this remote spot flowed the riches of the New World, and adventurers who had gathered wealth in the Americas spent here their declining years. It was in one of these houses that Don Callisto lived, and as I stood at the reja after pulling the bell, I was pleased to think that he lived in such a fitting style. There was a dilapidated grandeur about the massive gateway that suited my impression of the flamboyant poet. Though I heard the bell peal through the house, no one answered it, and I rang a second, and then a third time. At last an old woman with a heavy moustache came to the gate.
"What do you want?"
she said. She had fine black eyes, but a sullen look, and I supposed that it was she who took care of the old man. I gave her my card. "I have an appointment with your master." She opened the iron gateway and bade me enter. Asking me to wait, she left me and went upstairs. The patio was pleasantly cool after the street. Its proportions were noble, and you surmised that it had been built by some follower of the conquistadores. But the paint was tarnished, the tiles on the floor broken, and here and there great flakes of plaster had fallen away. There was about everything an air of poverty, but not of squalor. I knew that Don Callisto was poor. Money had come to him easily at times, but he had never attached any importance to it and had spent it profusely. It was plain that he lived now in a penury that he disdained to notice. In the middle of the patio was a table with a rocking chair on each side of it, and on the table newspapers a fortnight old. I wondered what dreams occupied his fancy as he sat there on the warm summer nights smoking cigarettes. On the walls under the colonnade were Spanish pictures, dark and bad, and here and there stood an ancient dusty bagüeño, and on it a mended lustre plate. By the side of a door hung a pair of old pistols, and I had a pleasant fancy that they were the weapons he had used when, in the most celebrated of his many duels, for the sake of Pepe Montañez, the dancer, now, I suppose, a toothless and raddled hag, he had killed the Duke of Dos Hermanos. The scene, with its associations, which I vaguely divined, so aptly fitted the romantic poet that I was overcome by the spirit of the place. Its noble indigence surrounded him with a glory as great as the magnificence of his youth. In him, too, there was the spirit of the old conquistadores, and it was becoming that he should finish his famous life in that ruined and magnificent house. Thus, surely, should a poet live and die. I had arrived cool enough and even somewhat bored at the prospect of my meeting, but now I began to grow a trifle nervous. I lit a cigarette. I had come at the time appointed, and wondered what detained the old man. The silence was strangely disturbing. Ghosts of the past thronged the silent patio, and an age dead and gone gained a sort of shadowy life for me. The men of that day had a passion and a wildness of spirit that are gone out of the world forever. We are no longer capable of their reckless deeds or their theatrical heroics. I heard a sound, and my heart beat quickly. I was excited now, and when at last I saw him coming slowly down the stairs, I caught my breath. He held my card in his hand. He was a tall old man and exceedingly thin, with a skin the color of old ivory. His hair was abundant and white, but his bushy eyebrows were dark still. They made his great eyes flash with a more sombre fire. It was wonderful that at his age those black eyes should still preserve their brilliance. His nose was aquiline, his mouth close set. His unsmiling eyes rested on me as he approached, and there was in them a look of cool appraisal. He was dressed in black, and in one hand held a broad-brimmed hat. There was in his bearing assurance and dignity. He was as I should have wished him to be, and as I watched him I understood how he had swayed men's minds and touched their hearts. He was every inch a poet. He had reached the patio and came slowly towards me. He had really the eyes of an eagle. It seemed to me a tremendous moment, for there he stood, the heir of the great old Spanish poets, the magnificent Herrera, the nostalgic and moving Fray Luis, Juan de la Cruz, the mystic, and the crabbed and obscure Góngora. He was the last of that long line, and he trod in their steps not unworthily. Strangely in my heart sang the lovely and tender song which is the most famous of Don Callisto's lyrics. I was abashed. It was fortunate for me that I had prepared beforehand the phrase with which I meant to greet him. It is a wonderful honor, Maestro, for a foreigner such as I to make the acquaintance of so great a poet. A flicker of amusement passed through those piercing eyes, and a smile for an instant curved the lines of that stern mouth.
I am not a poet, senor, but a bristle merchant. You have made a mistake. Don Callisto lives next door.
I had come to the wrong house. Louise by William Somerset Maugham. I could never understand why Louise bothered with me. She disliked me, and I knew that behind my back, in that gentle way of hers, she seldom lost the opportunity of saying a disagreeable thing about me. She had too much delicacy ever to make a direct statement, but with a hint and a sigh and a little flutter of her beautiful hands, she was able to make her meaning plain. She was a mistress of cold praise. It was true that we had known one another almost intimately for 25 years, but it was impossible for me to believe that she could be affected by the claims of old association. She thought me a coarse, brutal, cynical, and vulgar fellow. I was puzzled at her not taking the obvious course and dropping me. She did nothing of the kind. Indeed, she would not leave me alone. She was constantly asking me to lunch and dine with her, and once or twice a year invited me to spend a weekend at her house in the country. At last I thought that I had discovered her motive. She had an uneasy suspicion that I did not believe in her, and if that was why she did not like me, it was also why she sought my acquaintance. It galled her that I alone should look upon her as a comic figure, and she could not rest till I acknowledged myself mistaken and defeated. Perhaps she had an inkling that I saw the face behind the mask, and, because I alone held out, was determined that sooner or later I, too, should take the mask for the face. I was never quite certain that she was a complete humbug. I wondered whether she fooled herself as thoroughly as she fooled the world, or whether there was some spark of humour at the bottom of her heart. If there was, it might be that she was attracted to me, as a pair of crooks might be attracted to one another, by the knowledge that we shared a secret that was hidden from everybody else. I knew Louise before she married. She was then a frail, delicate girl with large and melancholy eyes. Her father and mother worshipped her with an anxious adoration, for some illness, scarlet fever, I think, had left her with a weak heart, and she had to take the greatest care of herself. When Tom Maitland proposed to her, they were dismayed, for they were convinced that she was much too delicate for the strenuous state of marriage. But they were not too well off, and Tom Maitland was rich. He promised to do everything in the world for Louise, and finally they entrusted her to him as a sacred charge. Tom Maitland was a big, husky fellow, very good-looking and a fine athlete. He doted on Louise. With her weak heart he could not hope to keep her with him long, and he made up his mind to do everything he could to make her few years on earth happy. He gave up the games he excelled in, not because she wished him to. She was glad that he should play golf and hunt, but because by coincidence she had a heart attack whenever he proposed to leave her for a day. If they had a difference of opinion, she gave in to him at once, for she was the most submissive wife a man could have. But her heart failed her, and she would be laid up, sweet and uncomplaining, for a week. He could not be such a brute as to cross her. Then they would have quite a little tussle about which should yield, and it was only with difficulty that at last he persuaded her to have her own way. On one occasion, seeing her walk 8 miles on an expedition that she particularly wanted to make, I suggested to Tom Maitland that she was stronger than one would have thought. He shook his head and sighed. No, she's dreadfully delicate. She's been to all the best heart specialists in the world, and they all say that her life hangs on a thread, but she has an unconquerable spirit. He told her that I had remarked on her endurance. "I shall pay for it tomorrow," she said to me in her plaintive way. "I shall be at death's door." "I sometimes think that you're quite strong enough to do the things you want to," I murmured. I had noticed that if a party was amusing, she could dance till 5 in the morning, but if it was dull, she felt very poorly, and Tom had to take her home early. I am afraid she did not like my reply, for though she gave me a pathetic little smile, I saw no amusement in her large blue eyes. "You can't very well expect me to fall down dead just to please you," she answered. Louise outlived her husband. He caught his death of cold one day when they were sailing, and Louise needed all the rugs there were to keep her warm. He left her a comfortable fortune and a daughter. Louise was inconsolable. It was wonderful that she managed to survive the shock. Her friends expected her speedily to follow poor Tom Maitland to the grave. Indeed, they already felt dreadfully sorry for Iris, her daughter, who would be left an orphan. They redoubled their attentions towards Louise. They would not let her stir a finger. They insisted on doing everything in the world to save her trouble. They had to, because if she was called upon to do anything tiresome or inconvenient, her heart went back on her, and there she was at death's door. She was entirely lost without a man to take care of her, she said, and she did not know how, with her delicate health, she was going to bring up her dear Iris. Her friends asked why she did not marry again. Oh, with her heart it was out of the question, and though of course she knew that dear Tom would have wished her to, and perhaps it would be the best thing for Iris if she did. But who would want to be bothered with a wretched invalid like herself? Oddly enough, more than one young man showed himself quite ready to undertake the charge, and a year after Tom's death she allowed George Hobhouse to lead her to the altar. He was a fine, upstanding fellow, and he was not at all badly off. I never saw anyone so grateful as he for the privilege of being allowed to take care of this frail little thing. "I shan't live to trouble you long," she said. He was a soldier, and an ambitious one, but he resigned his commission. Louise's health forced her to spend the winter at Monte Carlo and the summer at Deauville. He hesitated a little at throwing up his career, and Louise at first would not hear of it. But at last she yielded, as she always yielded, and he prepared to make his wife's last few years as happy as might be. "It can't be very long now," she said. "I'll try not to be troublesome." For the next 2 or 3 years, Louise managed, notwithstanding her weak heart, to go beautifully dressed to all the most lively parties, to gamble very heavily, to dance, and even to flirt with tall, slim young men. But George Hobhouse had not the stamina of Louise's first husband, and he had to brace himself now and then with a stiff drink for his day's work as Louise's second husband. It is possible that the habit would have grown on him, which Louise would not have liked at all, but very fortunately for her, the war broke out. He rejoined his regiment and 3 months later was killed. It was a great shock to Louise. She felt, however, that in such a crisis she must not give way to a private grief, and if she had a heart attack, nobody heard of it. In order to distract her mind, she turned her villa at Monte Carlo into a hospital for convalescent officers. Her friends told her that she would never survive the strain.
"Of course it will kill me," she said. "I know that. But what does it matter? I must do my bit."
It didn't kill her. She had the time of her life. There was no convalescent home in France that was more popular. I met her by chance in Paris. She was lunching at the Ritz with a tall, very handsome young Frenchman. She explained that she was there on business connected with the hospital. She told me that the officers were too charming to her. They knew how delicate she was, and they wouldn't let her do a single thing. They took care of her, well, as though they were all husbands. She sighed.
"Poor George! Who would ever have thought that I, with my heart, should survive him?"
"And poor Tom," I said. I don't know why she didn't like my saying that. She gave me her plaintive smile, and her beautiful eyes filled with tears.
"You always speak as though you grudged me the few years that I can expect to live."
"By the way, your heart's much better, isn't it?"
"I'll never be better. I saw a specialist this morning, and he said I must be prepared for the worst."
"Oh, well, you've been prepared for that for nearly 20 years now, haven't you?" When the war came to an end, Louise settled in London. She was now a woman of over 40, thin and frail still, with large eyes and pale cheeks. But she did not look a day more than 25. Iris, who had been at school and was now grown up, came to live with her.
"She'll take care of me,"
said Louise.
"Of course, it'll be hard on her to live with such a great invalid as I am, but it can only be for such a little while. I'm sure she won't mind."
Iris was a nice girl. She'd been brought up with the knowledge that her mother's health was precarious. As a child, she had never been allowed to make a noise. She'd always realized that her mother must on no account be upset. And though Louise told her now that she would not hear of her sacrificing herself for a tiresome old woman, the girl simply would not listen. It wasn't a question of sacrificing herself. It was a happiness to do what she could for her poor dear mother. With a sigh, her mother let her do a great deal.
"It pleases the child to think she's making herself useful," she said.
"Don't you think she ought to go out and about more?" I asked.
"That's what I'm always telling her. I can't get her to enjoy herself. Heaven knows I never want anyone to put themselves out on my account."
And Iris, when I remonstrated with her, said,
"Poor dear mother, she wants me to go and stay with friends and go to parties, but the moment I start off anywhere, she has one of her heart attacks, so I much prefer to stay at home."
But presently she fell in love. A young friend of mine, a very good lad, asked her to marry him, and she consented. I liked the child, and was glad that she was to be given at last the chance to lead a life of her own. She'd never seemed to suspect that such a thing was possible. But one day the young man came to me in great distress and told me that his marriage was indefinitely postponed. Iris felt that she could not desert her mother. Of course, it was really no business of mine, but I made the opportunity to go and see Louise. She was always glad to receive her friends at tea-time, and now that she was older, she cultivated the society of painters and writers. "Well, I hear that Iris isn't going to be married," I said after a little.
"I don't know about that. She's not going to be married quite as soon as I could have wished. I've begged her on my bended knees not to consider me, but she absolutely refuses to leave me."
"Don't you think it's rather hard on her?"
"Dreadfully. Of course it can only be for a few months.
But I hate the thought of anyone sacrificing themselves for me.
My dear Louise, you've buried 2 husbands. I can't see the least reason why you shouldn't bury at least 2 more.
Do you think that's funny?
She asked me, in a tone that she made as offensive as she could. I suppose it's never struck you as strange that you're always strong enough to do anything you want to, and that your weak heart only prevents you from doing things that bore you?
Oh, I know what you've always thought of me. You've never believed that I had anything the matter with me, have you?
I looked at her full and square. Never. I think you've carried out for 25 years a stupendous bluff. I think you're the most selfish and monstrous woman I have ever known. You ruined the lives of those 2 wretched men you married. And now you're going to ruin the life of your daughter. I should not have been surprised if Louise had had a heart attack then. I fully expected her to fly into a passion. She merely gave me a gentle smile.
My poor friend, one of these days you'll be so dreadfully sorry you said this to me.
Have you quite determined that Iris shall not marry this boy?
I've begged her to marry him. I know it'll kill me, but I don't mind. Nobody cares for me. I'm just a burden to everybody.
Did you tell her it would kill you?
She made me.
As if anyone ever made you do anything that you were not yourself quite determined to do.
She can marry her young man tomorrow, if she likes. If it kills me, it kills me.
Well, let's risk it, shall we?
Haven't you got any compassion for me?
One can't pity anyone who amuses one as much as you amuse me, I answered. A faint spot of colour appeared on Louise's pale cheeks, and though she smiled still, her eyes were hard and angry.
Iris shall marry in a month's time, she said. And if anything happens to me, I hope you and she will be able to forgive yourselves.
Louise was as good as her word. A date was fixed, a trousseau of great magnificence was ordered, and invitations were issued. Iris and the very good lad were radiant. On the wedding day, at 10 o'clock in the morning, Louise, that devilish woman, had one of her heart attacks and died. She died gently forgiving Iris for having killed her. The Closed Shop by William Somerset Maugham. Nothing would induce me to tell the name of the happy country in which the incidents occurred that I am constrained to relate. But I see no harm in admitting that it is a free and independent state on the continent of America. This is vague enough in all conscience, and can give rise to no diplomatic incident. Now, the president of this free and independent state had an eye to a pretty woman, and there came to his capital, a wide and sunny town with a plaza, a cathedral that was not without dignity, and a few old Spanish houses, a young person from Michigan of such a pleasing aspect that his heart went out to her. He lost no time in declaring his passion, and was gratified to learn that it was returned. But he was mortified to discover that the young person regarded his possession of a wife and her possession of a husband as a bar to their union. She had a feminine weakness for marriage. Though it seemed unreasonable to the president, he was not the man to refuse a pretty woman the gratification of her whim, and promised to make such arrangements as would enable him to offer her wedlock. He called his attorneys together and put the matter before them. He had long thought, he said, that for a progressive country their marriage laws were remarkably out of date, and he proposed, therefore, radically to amend them. The attorneys retired, and after a brief interval devised a divorce law that was satisfactory to the President. But the state of which I write was always careful to do things in a constitutional way, for it was a highly civilized, democratic, and reputable country. A president who respects himself and his oath of office cannot promulgate a law, even if it is to his own interest, without adhering to certain forms, and these things take time. The president had barely signed the decree that made the new divorce law valid when a revolution broke out, and he was very unfortunately hanged on a lamp-post in the plaza in front of the cathedral that was not without dignity. The young person of pleasing aspect left town in a hurry, but the law remained. Its terms were simple. On the payment of $100 gold and after a residence of 30 days, a man could divorce his wife or a wife her husband without even apprising the other party of the intended step. Your wife might tell you that she was going to spend a month with her aged mother, and one morning at breakfast, when you looked through your mail, you might receive a letter from her informing you that she had divorced you and was already married to another. Now, it was not long before the happy news spread here and there that at a reasonable distance from New York was a country, the capital of which had an equable climate and tolerable accommodation, where a woman could release herself expeditiously and with economy from the irksome bonds of matrimony. The fact that the operation could be performed without the husband's knowledge saved her from those preliminary and acrimonious discussions that are so wearing to the nerves. Every woman knows that however much a man may argue about a proposition, he will generally accept a fact with resignation. Tell him you want a Rolls-Royce, and he will say he can't afford it. But buy it, and he will sign his cheque like a lamb. So, in a very short time, beautiful women in considerable numbers began to come down to the pleasant, sunny town. Tired business women and women of fashion, women of pleasure and women of leisure. They came from New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. They came from Georgia, and they came from Dakota. They came from all the states in the Union. The passenger accommodation on the ships of the United Fruit Line was only just adequate to the demand, and if you wanted a stateroom to yourself, you had to engage it 6 months in advance. Prosperity descended upon the capital of this enterprising state, and in a very little while there was not a lawyer in it who did not own a Ford car. Don Augusto, the proprietor of the Grand Hotel, went to the expense of building several bathrooms. But he did not grudge it. He was making a fortune, and he never passed the lamp-post on which the outgoing president had been hanged without giving it a jaunty wave of his hand. "He was a great man," he said. "One day they will erect a statue to him." I have spoken as though it were only women who availed themselves of this convenient and reasonable law, and this might indicate that in the United States it is they, rather than men, who desire release from the impediment of holy matrimony. I have no reason to believe that this is so, though it was women in great majority who travelled to this country to get a divorce. I ascribe this to the fact that it is always easy for them to get away for 6 weeks, a week there, a week back, and 30 days to establish a domicile. But it is difficult for men to leave their affairs so long. It is true that they could go there during their summer holidays, but then the heat is somewhat oppressive. And besides, there are no golf links. It is reasonable enough to suppose that many a man will hesitate to divorce his wife when he can only do it at the cost of a month's golf. There were, of course, 2 or 3 males spending their 30 days at the Grand Hotel, but they were generally, for a reason that is obscure, commercial travellers. I can but imagine that by the nature of their avocations they were able at one and the same time to pursue freedom and profit. Be this as it may, the fact remains that the inmates of the Grand Hotel were for the most part women, and very gay it was in the patio at luncheon and at dinner, when they sat at little square tables under the arches discussing their matrimonial troubles and drinking champagne. Don Augusto did a roaring trade with the generals and colonels. There were more generals than colonels in the army of this state. The lawyers, bankers, merchants, and the young sparks of the town who came to look at these beautiful creatures. But the perfect is seldom realized in this world. There is always something that is not quite right, and women engaged in getting rid of their husbands are very properly in an agitated condition. It makes them at times hard to please. Now it must be confessed that this delightful little city, notwithstanding its manifold advantages, somewhat lacked places of amusement. There was but one cinema, and this showed films that had been wandering too long from their happy home in Hollywood. In the daytime you could have consultations with your lawyer, polish your nails, and do a little shopping, but the evenings were intolerable. There were many complaints that 30 days was a long time, and more than one impatient young thing asked her lawyer why they didn't put a little pep into their law and do the whole job in 8 and 40 hours. Don Augusto, however, was a man of resource, and presently he had an inspiration. He engaged a troupe of wandering Guatemaltecans who played the marimba. There is no music in the world that sets the toes so irresistibly tingling, and in a little while everyone in the patio began dancing. It is, of course, obvious that 25 beautiful women cannot dance with 3 commercial travellers, but there were all these generals and colonels, and there were all the young sparks of the town. They danced divinely, and they had great liquid black eyes. The hours flew, the days tripped one upon the heels of the other so quickly that the month passed before you realized it, and more than one of Don Augusto's guests, when she bade him farewell, confessed that she would willingly have stayed longer. Don Augusto was radiant. He liked to see people enjoy themselves. The marimba band was worth twice the money he paid for it, and it did his heart good to see his ladies dance with the gallant officers and the young men of the town. Since Don Augusto was thrifty, he always turned off the electric lights on the stairs and in the passages at 10 o'clock at night, and the gallant officers and the young men of the town improved their English wonderfully. Everything went as merrily as a marriage bell, if I may use a phrase that, however hackneyed, in this connection is irresistible, till one day Madame Coralie came to the conclusion that she had had enough of it. For one man's meat is another man's poison. She dressed herself and went to call on her friend Carmencita. After she had, in a few voluble words, stated the purpose of her visit, Carmencita called a maid and told her to run and fetch La Gorda. They had a matter of importance which they wished to discuss with her. La Gorda, a woman of ample proportions, with a heavy moustache, soon joined them, and over a bottle of Malaga the 3 of them held a momentous conversation. The result of it was that they indited a letter to the president asking for an audience. The new president was a hefty young man in the early 30s who, a few years before, had been a stevedore in the employment of an American firm, and he had risen to his present exalted station by natural eloquence and an effective use of his gun when he wanted to make a point or emphasize a statement. When one of his secretaries placed the letter before him, he laughed. "What do these 3 old faggots want with me?" But he was a good-natured fellow and accessible. He did not forget that he had been elected by the people, as one of the people, to protect the people. He had also, during his early youth, been employed for some months by Madame Coralie to run errands. He told his secretary that he would see them at 10 o'clock next morning. They went at the appointed hour to the palace, and were led up a noble stairway to the audience chamber. The official who conducted them knocked softly on the door. A barred Judas was opened, and a suspicious eye appeared. The president had no intention of suffering the fate of his predecessor if he could help it, and no matter who his visitors were, did not receive them without precaution. The official gave the three ladies names. The door was opened, but not too wide, and they slipped in. It was a handsome room, and various secretaries at little tables in their shirt-sleeves, and with a revolver on each hip, were busy typing. One or two other young men, heavily armed, were lying on sofas reading the papers and smoking cigarettes. The president, also in his shirt-sleeves, with a revolver in his belt, was standing with his thumbs in the sleeve-holes of his waistcoat. He was tall and stout, of a handsome and even dignified presence. "Que tal?" he cried joyfully, with a flash of his white teeth. "What brings you here, señoras?"
"How well you are looking, Don Manuel," said La Gorda. "You are a fine figure of a man."
He shook hands with them, and his staff, ceasing their strenuous activity, leaned back and cordially waved their hands to the three ladies. They were old friends, and the greetings, if a trifle sardonic, were hearty. I must disclose the fact now, which I could without doubt do in a manner so discreet that I might be misunderstood, but if you have to say something you may just as well say it plainly as not, that these three ladies were the madames of the three principal brothels in the capital of this free and independent state. La Gorda and Carmencita were of Spanish origin, and were very decently dressed in black, with black silk shawls over their heads. But Madame Coralie was French, and she wore a toque. They were all of mature age and of modest demeanour. The president made them sit down and offered them Madeira and cigarettes, but they refused.
"No, thank you, Don Manuel," said Madame Coralie. "It is on business that we have come to see you."
"Well, what can I do for you?" La Gorda and Carmencita looked at Madame Coralie, and Madame Coralie looked at La Gorda and Carmencita. They nodded, and she saw that they expected her to be their spokeswoman.
"Well, Don Manuel, it is like this. We are three women who have worked hard for many years, and not a breath of scandal has ever tarnished our good names. There are not in all the Americas three more distinguished houses than ours, and they are a credit to this beautiful city. Why, only last year I spent $500 to supply my sala principal with plate-glass mirrors. We have always been respectable, and we have paid our taxes with regularity. It is hard now that the fruits of our labor should be snatched away from us. I do not hesitate to say that after so many years of honest and conscientious attention to business, it is unjust that we should have to submit to such treatment."
The president was astounded. "But, Coralie, my dear, I do not know what you mean. Has anyone dared to claim money from you that the law does not sanction, or that I know nothing about?" He gave his secretaries a suspicious glance. They tried to look innocent, but though they were, only succeeded in looking uneasy.
"It is the law we complain of. Ruin stares us in the face."
"Ruin?"
"So long as this new divorce law is in existence, we can do no business, and we may just as well shut up our beautiful houses."
Then Madame Coralie explained in a manner so frank that I prefer to paraphrase her speech, that owing to this invasion of the town by beautiful ladies from a foreign land, the 3 elegant houses on which she and her 2 friends paid rates and taxes were utterly deserted. The young man of fashion preferred to spend their evenings at the Grand Hotel, where they received, for soft words, entertainment, which at the regular establishments they could only have got for hard cash. "You cannot blame them," said the President.
"I don't," cried Madame Coralie. "I blame the women. They have no right to come and take the bread out of our mouths. Don Manuel, you are one of the people. You are not one of these aristocrats. What will the country say if you allow us to be driven out of business by blacklegs? I ask you, is it just, is it honest?"
"But what can I do?" said the President. "I cannot lock them up in their rooms for 30 days. How am I to blame if these foreigners have no sense of decency?"
"It's different for a poor girl,"
said La Gorda.
"She has her way to make. But that these women do that sort of thing when they're not obliged to, no, that I shall never understand. It is a bad and wicked law,"
said Carmencita. The President sprang to his feet and threw his arms akimbo. "You are not going to ask me to abrogate a law that has brought peace and plenty to this country. I am of the people, and I was elected by the people, and the prosperity of my fatherland is very near my heart. Divorce is our staple industry, and the law shall be repealed only over my dead body."
"Oh, Maria Santissima, that it should come to this," said Carmencita. "And me with 2 daughters in a convent in New Orleans. In this business one often has unpleasantness, but I always consoled myself by thinking that my daughters would marry well, and when the time came for me to retire they would inherit my business. Do you think I can keep them in a convent in New Orleans for nothing? And who is going to keep my son at Harvard if I have to close my house, Don Manuel?"
asked La Gorda.
"As for myself,"
said Madame Coralie,
"I do not care. I shall return to France. My dear mother is 87 years of age, and she cannot live very much longer. It will be a comfort to her if I spend her last remaining years by her side, but it is the injustice of it that hurts. You have spent many happy evenings in my house, Don Manuel, and I am wounded that you should let us be treated like this. Do you not tell me yourself that it was the proudest day of your life when you entered as an honored guest the house in which you had once been employed as errand boy?"
"I do not deny it. I stood champagne all round." Don Manuel walked up and down the large hall, shrugging his shoulders as he went, and now and then, deep in thought, he gesticulated. "I am of the people, elected by the people," he cried. "And the fact is, these women are blacklegs." He turned to his secretaries with a dramatic gesture. "It is a stain on my administration. It is against all my principles to allow unskilled foreign labour to take the bread out of the mouths of honest and industrious people. These ladies are quite right to come to me and appeal for my protection. I will not allow this scandal to continue." It was, of course, a pointed and effective speech, but all who heard it knew that it left things exactly where they were. Madame Coralie powdered her nose and gave it, a commanding organ, a brief look in her pocket mirror.
"Of course I know what human nature is," she said, "and I can well understand that time hangs heavily on the hands of these creatures."
"We could build a golf course," hazarded one of the secretaries. "It is true that this would only occupy them by day."
"If they want men, why can't they bring them with them?"
said La Gorda. "Caramba!" cried the President, and with that stood on a sudden quite still. "There is the solution." He had not reached his exalted station without being a man of insight and resource. He beamed. "We will amend the law. Men shall come in as before without let or hindrance, but women only accompanied by their husbands or with their written consent." He saw the look of consternation which his secretaries gave him, and he waved his hand. "But the immigration authorities shall receive instructions to interpret the word husband with the widest latitude."
"Maria Santissima,"
cried Madame Coralie.
"if they come with a friend, he will take care that no one else interferes with them, and our customers will return to the houses where for so long they have been so hospitably entertained. Don Manuel, you are a great man, and one of these days they will erect a statue to you."
It is often the simplest expedients that settle the most formidable difficulties. The law was briefly amended according to the terms of Don Manuel's suggestion, and whereas prosperity continued to pour its blessings on the wide and sunny capital of this free and independent state, Madame Coralie was enabled profitably to pursue her usual avocations. Carmencita's 2 daughters completed their expensive education in the convent at New Orleans, and Lagorda's son successfully graduated at Harvard. The Promise by William Somerset Maugham. My wife is a very unpunctual woman, so when, having arranged to lunch with her at Claridge's, I arrived there 10 minutes late and did not find her, I was not surprised. I ordered a cocktail. It was the height of the season, and there were but 2 or 3 vacant tables in the lounge. Some of the people, after an early meal, were drinking their coffee. Others, like myself, were toying with a dry martini. The women in their summer frocks looked gay and charming, and the men debonair. But I could see no one whose appearance sufficiently interested me to occupy the quarter of an hour I was expecting to wait. They were slim and pleasant to look upon, well-dressed and carelessly at ease, but they were for the most part of a pattern, and I observed them with tolerance rather than with curiosity. But it was 2 o'clock, and I felt hungry. My wife tells me that she can neither wear a turquoise nor a watch, for the turquoise turns green and the watch stops, and this she attributes to the malignity of fate. I have nothing to say about the turquoise, but I sometimes think the watch might go if she wound it. I was engaged with these reflections when an attendant came up, and with that hushed significance that hotel attendants affect, as though their message held a more sinister meaning than their words suggested, told me that a lady had just telephoned to say that she had been detained and could not lunch with me. I hesitated. It is not very amusing to eat in a crowded restaurant by oneself, but it was late to go to a club, and I decided that I had better stay late where I was. I strolled into the dining room. It has never given me any particular satisfaction, as it appears to do to so many elegant persons, to be known by name to the head waiters of fashionable restaurants. But on this occasion I should certainly have been glad to be greeted by less stony an eye. The maître d'hôtel, with a set and hostile face, told me that every table was occupied. I looked helplessly round the large and stately room, and on a sudden, to my pleasure, caught sight of someone I knew. Lady Elizabeth Vermont was an old friend. She smiled, and noticing that she was alone, I went up to her. "Will you take pity on a hungry man, and let me sit with you?" I asked.
"Oh, do, but I've nearly finished."
She was at a little table by the side of a massive column, and when I took my place I found that, notwithstanding the crowd, we sat almost in privacy. "This is a bit of luck for me," I said. "I was on the point of fainting from hunger." She had a very agreeable smile. It did not light up her face suddenly, but seemed rather to suffuse it by degrees with charm. It hesitated for a moment about her lips, and then slowly travelled to those great shining eyes of hers, and there softly lingered. No one surely could say that Elizabeth Vermont was cast in the common mould. I never knew her when she was a girl, but many have told me that then she was so lovely it brought the tears to one's eyes, and I could well believe it. For now, though 50, she was still incomparable. Her ravaged beauty made the fresh and blooming comeliness of youth a trifle insipid. I do not like these painted faces that look all alike, and I think women are foolish to dull their expression and obscure their personality with powder, rouge, and lipstick. But Elizabeth Vermont painted not to imitate nature, but to improve it. You did not question the means, but applauded the result. The flaunting boldness with which she used cosmetics increased rather than diminished the character of that perfect face. I suppose her hair was dyed. It was black and sleek and shining. She held herself upright as though she had never learned to loll, and she was very slim. She wore a dress of black satin, the lines and simplicity of which were admirable, and about her neck was a long rope of pearls. Her only other jewel was an enormous emerald, which guarded her wedding ring, and its sombre fire emphasized the whiteness of her hand. But it was in her hands, with their reddened nails, that she most clearly betrayed her age. They had none of a girl's soft and dimpled roundness, and you could not but look at them with a certain dismay. Before very long they would look like the talons of a bird of prey. Elizabeth Vermont was a remarkable woman, of great birth, for she was the daughter of the 7th Duke of St. Erth. She married at the age of 18 a very rich man, and started at once upon a career of astounding extravagance, lewdness, and dissipation. She was too proud to be cautious, too reckless to think of consequences, and within 2 years her husband, in circumstances of appalling scandal, divorced her. She married then one of the 3 correspondents named in the case, and 18 months later ran away from him. Then followed a succession of lovers. She became notorious for her profligacy. Her startling beauty and her scandalous conduct held her in the public eye, and it was never very long but that she gave the gossips something to talk about. Her name stank in the nostrils of decent people. She was a gambler, a spendthrift, and a wanton. But though unfaithful to her lovers, she was constant to her friends, and there always remained a few who would never allow, whatever she did, that she was anything but a very nice woman. She had candour, high spirits, and courage. She was never a hypocrite. She was generous and sincere. It was at this period of her life that I came to know her. For great ladies, now that religion is out of fashion, when they are very much blown upon, take a flattering interest in the arts. When they receive the cold shoulder from members of their own class, they condescend sometimes to the society of writers, painters, and musicians. I found her an agreeable companion. She was one of those blessed persons who say quite fearlessly what they think, thus saving much useful time, and she had a ready wit. She was always willing to talk, with a diverting humour, of her lurid past. Her conversation, though uninstructed, was good, because notwithstanding everything, she was an honest woman. Then she did a very surprising thing. At the age of 40 she married a boy of 21. Her friends said it was the maddest act of all her life, and some who had stuck to her through thick and thin, now for the boy's sake, because he was nice and it seemed shameful thus to take advantage of his inexperience, refused to have anything more to do with her. It really was the limit. They prophesied disaster, for Elizabeth Vermont was incapable of sticking to any man for more than 6 months, Nay, they hoped for it, since it seemed the only chance for the wretched youth that his wife should behave so scandalously that he must leave her. They were all wrong. I do not know whether time was responsible for a change of heart in her, or whether Peter Vermont's innocence and simple love touched her, but the fact remains that she made him an admirable wife. They were poor, and she was extravagant, but she became a thrifty housewife. She grew on a sudden so careful of her reputation that the tongue of scandal was silenced. His happiness seemed her only concern. No one could doubt that she loved him devotedly. After being the subject of so much conversation for so long, Elizabeth Vermont ceased to be talked about. It looked as though her story were told. She was a changed woman, and I amused myself with the notion that when she was a very old lady, with many years of perfect respectability behind her, the past, the lurid past, would seem to belong not to her but to someone long since dead, whom once she had vaguely known. For women have an enviable faculty of forgetting. But who can tell what the fates have in store? In the twinkling of an eye, all was changed. Peter Vermont, after 10 years of an ideal marriage, fell madly in love with a girl called Barbara Canton. She was a nice girl, the youngest daughter of Lord Robert Canton, who was at one time Under-Secretary for Foreign Affairs, and she was pretty in a fair and fluffy way. Of course, she was not for a moment to be compared with Lady Elizabeth. Many people knew what had happened, but no one could tell whether Elizabeth Vermont had any inkling of it, and they wondered how she would meet a situation that was so foreign to her experience. It was always she who had discarded her lovers. None had deserted her. For my part, I thought she would make short work of little Miss Clanton. I knew her courage and her adroitness. All this was in my mind now while we chatted over our luncheon. There was nothing in her demeanour, as gay, charming, and frank as usual, to suggest that anything troubled her. She talked as she always talked, lightly but with good sense and a lively perception of the ridiculous, of the various topics which the course of conversation brought forward. I enjoyed myself. I came to the conclusion that by some miracle she had no notion of Peter's changed feelings, and I explained this to myself by the supposition that her love for him was so great she could not conceive that his for her might be less. We drank our coffee and smoked a couple of cigarettes, and she asked me the time, 2:45.
"I must ask for my bill."
"Won't you let me stand you lunch?"
"Of course,"
she smiled. "Are you in a hurry?"
"I'm meeting Peter at 3.
"Oh, how is he?"
"He's very well."
She gave a little smile, that tardy and delightful smile of hers, but I seemed to discern in it a certain mockery. For an instant she hesitated, and she looked at me with deliberation.
"You like curious situations, don't you?" she said. "You'd never guess the errand I'm bound on. I rang up Peter this morning and asked him to meet me at 3. I'm going to ask him to divorce me."
"You're not," I cried. I felt myself flush, and did not know what to say. "I thought you got on so well together."
"Do you think it's likely that I shouldn't know what all the world knows? I'm really not such a fool as all that."
She was not a woman to whom it was possible to say what one did not believe, and I could not pretend that I did not know what she meant. I remained silent for a second or two. "Why should you allow yourself to be divorced?"
"Robert Canton is a stuffy old thing. I very much doubt if he'd let Barbara marry Peter if I divorced him. And for me, you know, it isn't of the smallest consequence. One divorce more or less."
She shrugged her pretty shoulders. "How do you know he wants to marry her?"
"He's head over ears in love with her."
"Has he told you so?"
"No. He doesn't even know that I know. He's been so wretched, poor darling. He's been trying so hard not to hurt my feelings."
"Perhaps it's only a momentary infatuation," I hazarded. "It may pass."
"Why should it? Barbara's young and pretty. She's quite nice. They're very well suited to one another. And besides, what good would it do if it did pass? They love each other now, and the present in love is all that matters. I'm 19 years older than Peter. If a man stops loving a woman old enough to be his mother, do you think he'll ever come to love her again? You're a novelist. You must know more about human nature than that."
"Why should you make this sacrifice?"
"When he asked me to marry him 10 years ago, I promised him that when he wanted his release, he should have it. You see, there was so great a disproportion between our ages, I thought that was only fair."
"And are you going to keep a promise that he hasn't asked you to keep?" She gave a little flutter of those long, thin hands of hers, and now I felt that there was something ominous in the dark glitter of that emerald.
"Oh, I must, you know. One must behave like a gentleman. To tell you the truth, that's why I'm lunching here today. It was at this table that he proposed to me. We were dining together, you know, and I was sitting just where I am now. The nuisance is that I'm just as much in love with him now as I was then."
She paused for a minute, and I could see that she clenched her teeth.
"Well, I suppose I ought to go. Peter hates one to keep him waiting."
She gave me a sort of little helpless look, and it struck me that she simply could not bring herself to rise from her chair. But she smiled, and with an abrupt gesture sprang to her feet. "Would you like me to come with you?"
"As far as the hotel door,"
she smiled. We walked through the restaurant and the lounge, and when we came to the entrance, a porter swung round the revolving doors. I asked if she would like a taxi.
"No, I'd sooner walk. It's such a lovely day."
She gave me her hand.
"It's been so nice to see you. I shall go abroad tomorrow, but I expect to be in London all the autumn. Do ring me up."
She smiled and nodded and turned away. I watched her walk up Davies Street. The air was still bland and spring-like, and above the roofs little white clouds were sailing leisurely in a blue sky. She held herself very erect, and the poise of her head was gallant. She was a slim and lovely figure, so that people looked at her as they passed. I saw her bow graciously to some acquaintance who raised his hat, and I thought that never in 1,000 years would it occur to him that she had a breaking heart. I repeat, she was a very honest woman. A String of Beads by William Somerset Maugham.
"What a bit of luck that I'm placed next to you,"
said Laura as we sat down to dinner. "For me," I replied politely.
"That remains to be seen. I particularly wanted to have the chance of talking to you. I've got a story to tell you."
At this my heart sank a little. "I'd sooner you talked about yourself," I answered, "or even about me."
"No, but I must tell you the story. I think you'll be able to use it."
"If you must, you must. But let's look at the menu first."
"Don't you want me to?"
she said, somewhat aggrieved.
"I thought you'd be pleased."
"I am. You might have written a play and wanted to read me that."
"It happened to some friends of mine. It's perfectly true."
"That's no recommendation. A true story is never quite so true as an invented one."
"What does that mean?"
"Nothing very much," I admitted, "but I thought it sounded well."
"I wish you'd let me get on with it."
"I'm all attention. I'm not going to eat the soup, it's fattening." She gave me a pinched look and then glanced at the menu. She uttered a little sigh.
"Oh, well, if you're going to deny yourself, I suppose I must too. Heaven knows I can't afford to take liberties with my figure."
"And yet, is there any soup more heavenly than the sort of soup in which you put a great dollop of cream?"
"Bosh,"
she sighed.
"It's the only soup I really like."
"Never mind. Tell me your story, and we'll forget about food till the fish comes."
"Well, I was actually there when it happened. I was dining with the Livingstons. Do you know the Livingstons?"
"No, I don't think I do."
"Well, you can ask them and they'll confirm every word I say. They'd asked their governess to come in to dinner because some woman had thrown them over at the last moment. You know how inconsiderate people are. And they would have been 13 at table. Their governess was a Miss Robinson, quite a nice girl, young, 20 or 21, and rather pretty. Personally, I would never engage a governess who was young and pretty. One never knows."
"But one hopes for the best." Laura paid no attention to my remark.
"The chances are that she'll be thinking of young men instead of attending to her duties, and then, just when she's got used to your ways, she'll want to go and get married. But Miss Robinson had excellent references, and I must allow that she was a very nice, respectable person. I believe, in point of fact, she was a clergyman's daughter. There was a man at dinner whom I don't suppose you've ever heard of, but who's quite a celebrity in his way. He's a Count Borselli, and he knows more about precious stones than anyone in the world. He was sitting next to Mary Lingate, who rather fancies herself on her pearls. And in the course of conversation she asked him what he thought of the string she was wearing. He said it was very pretty. She was rather piqued at this, and told him it was valued at £8,000. "Yes, it's worth that," he said. Miss Robinson was sitting opposite to him. She was looking rather nice that evening. Of course, I recognized her dress. It was one of Sophie's old ones, but if you hadn't known Miss Robinson was the governess, you would never have suspected it. "That's a very beautiful necklace that young lady has on," said Borselli. "Oh, but that's Mrs. Livingston's governess," said Mary Lingate. "I can't help that," he said. "She's wearing one of the finest strings of pearls for its size that I've ever seen in my life. It must be worth £50,000. "Nonsense. I give you my word it is." Mary Lingate leant over. She has rather a shrill voice. "Miss Robinson, do you know what Count Borselli says?" she exclaimed. "He says that string of pearls you're wearing is worth £50,000. Just at that moment there was a sort of pause in the conversation, so that everybody heard. We all turned and looked at Miss Robinson. She flushed a little and laughed. "Well, I made a very good bargain," she said, "because I paid 15 shillings for it." "You certainly did." We all laughed. It was, of course, absurd. We've all heard of wives palming off on their husbands as false a string of pearls that was real and expensive. That story is as old as the hills.
"Thank you," I said, thinking of a little narrative of my own.
But it was too ridiculous to suppose that a governess would remain a governess if she owned a string of pearls worth £50,000. It was obvious that the Count had made a bloomer. Then an extraordinary thing happened. The long arm of coincidence came in.
"It shouldn't," I retorted. "It's had too much exercise. Haven't you seen that charming book called A Dictionary of English Usage?"
I wish you wouldn't interrupt, just when I'm really getting to the exciting point.
But I had to do so again, for just then a young grilled salmon was insinuated round my left elbow. "Mrs. Livingston is giving us a heavenly dinner," I said.
"Is salmon fattening?"
asked Laura. "Very," I answered, as I took a large helping.
"Bunk,"
she said. "Go on," I begged her. The long arm of coincidence was about to make a gesture.
"Well, at that very moment the butler bent over Miss Robinson and whispered something in her ear. I thought she turned a trifle pale. It's such a mistake not to wear rouge. You never know what tricks nature will play on you. She certainly looked startled. She leant forwards. "Mrs. Livingston, Dawson says there are 2 men in the hall who want to speak to me at once." "Well, you'd better go," said Sophie Livingston. Miss Robinson got up and left the room. Of course, the same thought flashed through all our minds, but I said it first. "I hope they haven't come to arrest her," I said to Sophie. "It would be too dreadful for you, my dear." "Are you sure it was a real necklace, Borselli?" she asked. "Oh, quite." "She could hardly have had the nerve to wear it tonight if it were stolen," I said. Sophie Livingston turned as pale as death under her makeup, and I saw she was wondering if everything was all right in her jewel case. I only had on a little chain of diamonds, but instinctively I put my hand up to my neck to feel if it was still there. "Don't talk nonsense," said Mr. Livingston. "How on earth would Miss Robinson have had the chance of sneaking a valuable string of pearls?" "She may be a receiver," I said. "Oh, but she had such wonderful references," said Sophie. "They always do," I said.
I was positively forced to interrupt Laura once more. "You don't seem to have been determined to take a very bright view of the case," I remarked.
Of course, I knew nothing against Miss Robinson, and I had every reason to think her a very nice girl, but it would have been rather thrilling to find out that she was a notorious thief and a well-known member of a gang of international crooks.
Just like a film. I'm dreadfully afraid that it's only in films that exciting things like that happen.
Well, we waited in breathless suspense. There was not a sound. I expected to hear a scuffle in the hall, or at least a smothered shriek. I thought the silence very ominous. Then the door opened and Miss Robinson walked in. I noticed at once that the necklace was gone. I could see that she was pale and excited. She came back to the table, sat down, and, with a smile, threw on it.
On what?
On the table, you fool. A string of pearls. "There's my necklace," she said. Count Borselli leant forwards. "Oh, but those are false," he said. "I told you they were," she laughed. "That's not the same string that you had on a few moments ago," he said. She shook her head and smiled mysteriously. We were all intrigued. I don't know that Sophie Livingston was so very much pleased at her governess making herself the centre of interest like that, and I thought there was a suspicion of tartness in her manner when she suggested that Miss Robinson had better explain. Well, Miss Robinson said that when she went into the hall, she found two men who said they'd come from Jarrett's stores. She'd bought her string there, as she said, for 15 shillings. And she'd taken it back because the clasp was loose, and had only fetched it that afternoon. The men said they had given her the wrong string. Someone had left a string of real pearls to be restrung, and the assistant had made a mistake. Of course, I can't understand how anyone could be so stupid as to take a really valuable string to Jarrett's. They aren't used to dealing with that sort of thing, and they wouldn't know real pearls from false. But you know what fools some women are. Anyhow, it was the string Miss Robinson was wearing, and it was valued at £50,000. She naturally gave it back to them. She couldn't do anything else, I suppose, though it must have been a wrench, and they returned her own string to her. Then they said that although, of course, they were under no obligation— you know the silly, pompous way men talk when they're trying to be businesslike— they were instructed as a solatium, or whatever you call it, to offer her a cheque for £300. Miss Robinson actually showed it to us. She was as pleased as Punch.
Well, it was a piece of luck, wasn't it?
You'd have thought so. As it turned out, it was the ruin of her.
Oh? How was that?
Well, when the time came for her to go on her holiday, she told Sophie Livingston that she'd made up her mind to go to Deauville for a month and blow the whole £300. Of course, Sophie tried to dissuade her and begged her to put the money in the savings bank, but she wouldn't hear of it. She said she'd never had such a chance before and would never have it again, and she meant for at least 4 weeks to live like a duchess. Sophie couldn't really do anything, and so she gave way. She sold Miss Robinson a lot of clothes that she didn't want. She'd been wearing them all through the season and was sick to death of them. She says she gave them to her, but I don't suppose she quite did that. I dare say she sold them very cheap. and Miss Robinson started off entirely alone for Deauville. What do you think happened then?"
"I haven't a notion," I replied. "I hope she had the time of her life."
"Well, a week before she was due to come back, she wrote to Sophie and said that she'd changed her plans and had entered another profession, and hoped that Mrs. Livingston would forgive her if she didn't return. Of course, poor Sophie was furious. What had actually happened was that Miss Robinson had picked up a rich Argentine in Deauville and had gone off to Paris with him. She's been in Paris ever since. I've seen her myself at Florence's, with bracelets right up to her elbow and ropes of pearls round her neck. Of course, I cut her dead. They say she has a house in the Bois de Boulogne, and I know she has a Rolls. She threw over the Argentine in a few months and then got hold of a Greek. I don't know who she's with now, but the long and short of it is that she's far and away the smartest cocotte in Paris."
"When you say she was ruined, you use the word in a purely technical sense, I conclude," said I.
"I don't know what you mean by that," said Laura. "But don't you think you could make a story out of it?"
"Unfortunately, I've already written a story about a pearl necklace. One can't go on writing stories about pearl necklaces."
"I've got half a mind to write it myself, only of course I should change the end."
"Oh, how would you end it?"
"Well, I should have had her engaged to a bank clerk who had been badly knocked about in the war, with only one leg, say, or half his face shot away. And they'd be dreadfully poor, and there would be no prospect of their marriage for years, and he would be putting all his savings into buying a little house in the suburbs, and they'd have arranged to marry when he had saved the last instalment. And then she takes him the £300, and they can hardly believe it. They're so happy, and he cries on her shoulder. He just cries like a child. And they get the little house in the suburbs, and they marry, and they have his old mother to live with them, and he goes to the bank every day, and if she's careful not to have babies, she can still go out as a daily governess, and he's often ill with his wound, you know, and she nurses him, and it's all very pathetic and sweet and lovely."
"It sounds rather dull to me," I ventured.
"Yes, but moral,"
said Laura. The Bum by William Somerset Maugham. God knows how often I had lamented that I had not half the time I needed to do half the things I wanted. I could not remember when last I had had a moment to myself. I had often amused my fancy with the prospect of just 1 week's complete idleness. Most of us, when not busy working, are busy playing. We ride, play tennis or golf, swim or gamble. But I saw myself doing nothing at all. I would lounge through the morning, dawdle through the afternoon, and loaf through the evening. My mind would be a slate, and each passing hour a sponge that wiped out the scribblings written on it by the world of sense. Time, because it is so fleeting, time, because it is beyond recall, is the most precious of human goods, and to squander it is the most delicate form of dissipation in which man can indulge. Cleopatra dissolved in wine a priceless pearl, but she gave it to Antony to drink. When you waste the brief golden hours, you take the beaker in which the gem is melted and dash its contents to the ground. The gesture is grand, and like all grand gestures, absurd. That, of course, is its excuse. In the week I promised myself I should naturally read, for to the habitual reader, reading is a drug of which he is the slave. Deprive him of printed matter, and he grows nervous, moody, and restless. Then, like the alcoholic bereft of brandy who will drink shellac or methylated spirit, he will make do with the advertisements of a paper 5 years old, He will make do with a telephone directory. But the professional writer is seldom a disinterested reader. I wished my reading to be but another form of idleness. I made up my mind that if ever the happy day arrived when I could enjoy untroubled leisure, I would complete an enterprise that had always tempted me, but which hitherto, like an explorer making reconnaissances into an undiscovered country, I had done little more than enter upon. I would read the entire works of Nick Carter. But I had always fancied myself choosing my moment with surroundings to my liking, not having it forced upon me. And when I was suddenly faced with nothing to do, and had to make the best of it, like a steamship acquaintance whom in the wide waste of the Pacific Ocean you have invited to stay with you in London, and who turns up without warning and with all his luggage, I was not a little taken aback. I had come to Veracruz from Mexico City to catch one of the Ward Company's white, cool ships to Yucatan, and found to my dismay that, a dock strike having been declared overnight, my ship would not put in. I was stuck in Veracruz. I took a room in the Hotel Diligencias, overlooking the plaza, and spent the morning looking at the sights of the town. I wandered down side streets and peeped into quaint courts. I sauntered through the parish church. It is picturesque with its gargoyles and flying buttresses, and the salt wind and the blazing sun have patined its harsh and massive walls with the mellowness of age. Its cupola is covered with white and blue tiles. Then I found that I had seen all that was to be seen, and I sat down in the coolness of the arcade that surrounded the square, and ordered a drink. The sun beat down on the plaza with a merciless splendor. The cocoa palms drooped dusty and bedraggled. Great black buzzards perched on them for a moment uneasily, swooped to the ground to gather some bit of offal, and then with lumbering wings flew up to the church tower. I watched the people crossing the square. Negroes, Indians, Creoles, and Spanish, the motley people of the Spanish Main, and they varied in colour from ebony to ivory. As the morning wore on, the tables around me filled up, chiefly with men who had come to have a drink before luncheon, for the most part in white ducks, but some notwithstanding the heat and the dark clothes of professional respectability. A small band, a guitarist, a blind fiddler, and a harpist played ragtime, and after every other tune the guitarist came round with a plate. I had already bought the local paper, and I was adamant to the news vendors who pertinaciously sought to sell me more copies of the same sheet. I refused, 20 times at least, the solicitations of grimy urchins who wanted to shine my spotless shoes, and having come to the end of my small change, I could only shake my head at the beggars who importuned me. They gave one no peace. Little Indian women in shapeless rags, each one with a baby tied in the shawl on her back, held out skinny hands, and in a whimper recited a dismal screed. Blind men were led up to my table by small boys. The maimed, the halt, the deformed exhibited the sores and the monstrosities with which nature or accident had afflicted them, and half-naked, underfed children whined endlessly their demand for coppers. But these kept their eyes open for the fat policeman who would suddenly dart out on them with a thong and give them a sharp cut on the back or over the head. Then they would scamper, only to return again when, exhausted by the exercise of so much energy, he relapsed into lethargy. But suddenly my attention was attracted by a beggar who, unlike the rest of them, and indeed the people sitting round me, swarthy and black-haired, had hair and beard of a red so vivid that it was startling. His beard was ragged, and his long mop of hair looked as though it had not been brushed for months. He wore only a pair of trousers and a cotton singlet, but they were tatters, grimy and foul, that barely held together. I have never seen anyone so thin. His legs, His naked arms were but skin and bone, and through the rents of his singlet you saw every rib of his wasted body. You could count the bones of his dust-covered feet. Of that starveling band he was easily the most abject. He was not old. He could not well have been more than 40, and I could not but ask myself what had brought him to this pass. It was absurd to think that he would not have worked if work he had been able to get. He was the only one of the beggars who did not speak. The rest of them poured forth their litany of woe, and if it did not bring the alms they asked, continued until an impatient word from you chased them away. He said nothing. I suppose he felt that his look of destitution was all the appeal he needed. He did not even hold out his hand. He merely looked at you, but with such wretchedness in his eyes, such despair in his attitude, it was dreadful. He stood on and on, silent and immobile, gazing steadfastly, and then, if you took no notice of him, he moved slowly to the next table. If he was given nothing, he showed neither disappointment nor anger. If someone offered him a coin, he stepped forward a little, stretched out his claw-like hand, took it without a word of thanks, and impassively went his way. I had nothing to give him, and when he came to me, so that he should not wait in vain, I shook my head. "Dispense usted por Dios," I said, using the polite Castilian formula with which the Spaniards refuse a beggar. But he paid no attention to what I said. He stood in front of me for as long as he stood at the other tables, looking at me with tragic eyes. I have never seen such a wreck of humanity. There was something terrifying in his appearance. He did not look quite sane. At length he passed on. It was 1 o'clock, and I had lunch. When I awoke from my siesta, it was still very hot, but towards evening a breath of air coming in through the windows, which I had at last ventured to open, tempted me into the plaza. I sat down under my arcade and ordered a long drink. Presently people in greater numbers filtered into the open space from the surrounding streets. The tables in the restaurants round it filled up, and in the kiosk in the middle the band began to play. The crowd grew thicker. On the free benches people sat huddled together like dark grapes clustered on a stalk. There was a lively hum of conversation. The big black buzzards flew screeching overhead, swooping down when they saw something to pick up, or scurrying away from under the feet of the passers-by. As twilight descended, they swarmed, it seemed, from all parts of the town towards the church tower. They circled heavily about it, and hoarsely crying, squabbling and jangling, settled themselves uneasily to roost. And again boot-blacks begged me to have my shoes cleaned. Newsboys pressed dank papers upon me. Beggars whined their plaintive demand for alms. I saw once more that strange red-bearded fellow, and watched him stand motionless, with the crushed and piteous air, before one table after another. He did not stop before mine. I supposed he remembered me from the morning, and having failed to get anything from me then, thought it useless to try again. You do not often see a red-haired Mexican, and because it was only in Russia that I had seen men of so destitute a mien, I asked myself if he was by chance a Russian. It accorded well enough with the Russian fecklessness that he should have allowed himself to sink to such a depth of degradation. Yet he had not a Russian face. His emaciated features were clear-cut, and his blue eyes were not set in the head in a Russian manner. I wondered if he could be a sailor, English, Scandinavian, or American, who had deserted his ship and by degrees sunk to this pitiful condition. He disappeared. Since there was nothing else to do, I stayed on till I got hungry, and when I had eaten, came back. I sat on till the thinning crowd suggested it was bedtime. I confess that the day had seemed long, and I wondered how many similar days I should be forced to spend there. but I woke after a little while and could not get to sleep again. My room was stifling. I opened the shutters and looked out at the church. There was no moon, but the bright stars faintly lit its outline. The buzzards were closely packed on the cross above the cupola, and on the edges of the tower, and now and then they moved a little. The effect was uncanny, and then, I have no notion why, that red scarecrow recurred to my mind, and I had suddenly a strange feeling that I had seen him before. It was so vivid that it drove away from me the possibility of sleep. I felt sure that I had come across him, but when and where I could not tell. I tried to picture the surroundings in which he might take his place, but I could see no more than a dim figure against a background of fog, and as the dawn approached it grew a little cooler, and I was able to sleep. I spent my second day at Veracruz as I had spent the first, but I watched for the coming of the red-haired beggar, and as he stood at the tables near mine, I examined him with attention. I felt certain now that I had seen him somewhere. I even felt certain that I had known him and talked to him, but I still could recall none of the circumstances. Once more he passed my table without stopping, and when his eyes met mine, I looked in them for some gleam of recollection. Nothing. I wondered if I had made a mistake, and thought I had seen him in the same way as sometimes, by some queer motion of the brain, in the act of doing something you are convinced that you are repeating an action that you have done at some past time. I could not get out of my head the impression that at some moment he had entered into my life. I racked my brains. I was sure now that he was either English or American, but I was shy of addressing him. I went over in my mind the possible occasions when I might have met him. Not to be able to place him exasperated me, as it does when you try to remember a name that is on the tip of your tongue and yet eludes you. The day wore on. Another day came, another morning, another evening. It was Sunday, and the plaza was more crowded than ever. The tables under the arcade were packed. As usual, the red-haired beggar came along, a terrifying figure in his silence, his threadbare rags and his pitiful distress. He was standing in front of a table only 2 from mine, mutely beseeching, but without a gesture. Then I saw the policeman who at intervals tried to protect the public from the importunities of all these beggars sneak round a column and give him a resounding whack with his thong. His thin body winced, but he made no protest and showed no resentment. He seemed to accept the stinging blow as in the ordinary course of things, and with his slow movements slunk away into the gathering night of the plaza. But the cruel stripe had whipped my memory, and suddenly I remembered. Not his name, that escaped me still, but everything else. He must have recognized me, for I have not changed very much in 20 years, and that was why after that first morning he had never paused in front of my table. Yes, it was 20 years since I had known him. I was spending a winter in Rome, and every evening I used to dine in a restaurant in the Via Sistina where you got excellent macaroni and a good bottle of wine. It was frequented by a little band of English and American art students, and 1 or 2 writers, and we used to stay late into the night, engaged in interminable arguments upon art and literature. He used to come in with a young painter who was a friend of his. He was only a boy then. He could not have been more than 22, and with his blue eyes, straight nose, and red hair, he was pleasing to look at. I remembered that he spoke a great deal of Central America. He had had a job with the American Fruit Company, but had thrown it over because he wanted to be a writer. He was not popular among us because he was arrogant, and we were none of us old enough to take the arrogance of youth with tolerance. He thought us poor fish, and did not hesitate to tell us so. He would not show us his work, because our praise meant nothing to him, and he despised our censure. His vanity was enormous. It irritated us, but some of us were uneasily aware that it might perhaps be justified. Was it possible that the intense consciousness of genius that he had rested on no grounds? He had sacrificed everything to be a writer. He was so certain of himself that he infected some of his friends with his own assurance. I recall his high spirits, his vitality, his confidence in the future, and his disinterestedness. It was impossible that it was the same man, and yet I was sure of it. I stood up, paid for my drink, and went out into the plaza to find him. My thoughts were in turmoil. I was aghast. I had thought of him now and then, and idly wondered what had become of him. I could never have imagined that he was reduced to this frightful misery. There are hundreds, thousands of youths who enter upon the hard calling of the arts with extravagant hopes, but for the most part they come to terms with their mediocrity and find somewhere in life a niche where they can escape starvation. This was awful. I asked myself what had happened. What hopes deferred had broken his spirit, what disappointments shattered him, and what lost illusions ground him to the dust. I asked myself if nothing could be done. I walked round the plaza. He was not in the arcades. There was no hope of finding him in the crowd that circled round the bandstand. The light was waning, and I was afraid I had lost him. Then I passed the church and saw him sitting on the steps. I cannot describe what a lamentable object he looked. Life had taken him, rent him on its racks, torn him limb from limb, and then flung him, a bleeding wreck, on the stone steps of that church. I went up to him. "Do you remember Rome?" I said. He did not move. He did not answer. He took no more notice of me than if I were not standing before him. He did not look at me. His vacant blue eyes rested on the buzzards that were screaming and tearing at some object at the bottom of the steps. I did not know what to do. I took a yellow-backed note out of my pocket and pressed it in his hand. He did not give it a glance, but his hand moved a little. The thin, claw-like fingers closed on the note and scrunched it up. He made it into a little ball, and then, edging it onto his thumb, flicked it into the air so that it fell among the jangling buzzards. I turned my head instinctively and saw one of them seize it in his beak and fly off, followed by two others screaming behind it. When I looked back, the man was gone. I stayed 3 more days in Veracruz. I never saw him again. Straight Flush by William Somerset Maugham. I am not a bad sailor, and when under stress of weather the game broke up, I did not go below. We were in the habit of playing poker into the small hours, a mild game that could hurt nobody, but it had been blowing all day, and with nightfall the wind strengthened to half a gale. 1 or 2 of our bunch admitted that they felt none too comfortable, and 1 or 2 others played with unwonted detachment. But even if you are not sick, dirty weather at sea is an unpleasant thing. I hate the fool who tells you he loves a storm, and tramping the deck lustily vows that it can never be too rough for him. When the woodwork groans and creaks, glasses crash to the floor, and you lurch in your chair as the ship heels over, when the wind howls and the waves thunder against the side, I very much prefer dry land. I think no one was sorry when one of the players said he had had enough, and the last round of jackpots was agreed to without demur. I remained alone in the smoking-room, for I knew I should not easily get to sleep in that racket, and I could not read in bed with any comfort when the North Pacific kept dashing itself against my portholes. I shuffled together the 2 packs we had been playing with and set out a complicated patience. I had been playing about 10 minutes when the door was opened with a blast of wind that sent my cards flying, and 2 passengers, rather breathless, slipped into the smoking-room. We were not a full ship, and we were 10 days out from Hong Kong, so that I had had time to become acquainted with pretty well everyone on board. I had spoken on several occasions to the pair who now entered, and seeing me by myself, they came over to my table. They were very old men, both of them. That perhaps was what had brought them together, for they had first met when they got on board at Hong Kong, and now you saw them sitting together in the smoking-room most of the day, not talking very much, but just comfortable to be side by side, with a bottle of Vichy water between them. They were very rich old men, too, and that was a bond between them. The rich feel at ease in one another's company. They know that money means merit. Their experience of the poor is that they always want something. It is true that the poor admire the rich, and it is pleasant to be admired, but they envy them as well, and this prevents their admiration from being quite candid. Mr. Rosenbaum was a little hunched-up Jew, very frail in clothes that looked too big for him, and he gave you the impression of hanging on to mortality only by a hair. His ancient, emaciated body looked as though it were already attacked by the corruption of the grave. The only expression his face ever bore was one of cunning, but it was purely habitual, the result of ever so many years' astuteness. He was a kindly, friendly person, very free with his drinks and cigars, and his charity was world famous. The other was called Donaldson. He was a Scot, but had gone to California as a little boy, and made a great deal of money mining. He was short and stout, with a red, clean-shaven, shiny face, and no hair but a sickle of silver above his neck, and very gentle eyes. Whatever force he had had to make his way in the world had been worn away by the years, and he was now a picture of mild beneficence. "I thought you'd turned in long ago," I remarked. "I should have," returned the Scot. "Only Mr. Rosenbaum kept me talking of old times." "What's the good of going to bed when you can't sleep?" said Mr. Rosenbaum. "Walk 10 times round the deck with me tomorrow morning, and you'll sleep all right. I've never taken any exercise in my life, and I'm not going to begin now." "That's foolishness. You'd be twice the man you are now if you'd take exercise. Look at me. You'd never think I was 79, would you?" Mr. Rosenbaum looked critically at Mr. Donaldson. "No, I wouldn't. You're very well preserved. You look younger than me, and I'm only 76. But then, I never had a chance to take care of myself." At that moment, the steward came up. "The bar's just going to close, gentlemen. Is there anything I can get you?" "It's a stormy night," said Mr. Rosenbaum. "Let's have a bottle of champagne. Small Vichy for me," said Mr. Donaldson. "Oh, very well, small Vichy for me too." The steward went away. "But mind you," continued Mr. Rosenbaum testily, "I wouldn't have done without the things you've done without, not for all the money in the world." Mr. Donaldson gave me his gentle smile. Mr. Rosenbaum can't get over it because I've never touched a card nor a drop of alcohol for 57 years. Now I ask you, what sort of a life is that? I was a very heavy drinker when I was a young fellow, and a desperate gambler, but I had a very terrible experience. It was a lesson to me, and I took it. Tell him about it, said Mr. Rosenbaum. He's an author. He'll write it up, and perhaps he'll be able to make his passage money. It's not a story I like telling very much, even now. I'll make it as short as I can. Me and 3 others had staked out a claim. Friends, all of us, and the oldest wasn't 25. There was me and my partner and a couple of brothers. McDermott, their name was. But they were more like friends than brothers. What was one's was the other's, and one wouldn't go into town without the other went too. And they were always laughing and joking together. A fine, clean pair of boys, over 6 feet high, both of them, and handsome. We were a wild bunch, and we had pretty good luck on the whole. And when we made money, we didn't hesitate to spend it. Well, one night we'd all been drinking very heavily, and we started a poker game. I guess we were a good deal drunker than we realized. Anyhow, suddenly, a row started between the McDermotts. One of them accused the other of cheating. "You take that back," cried Jamie. "I'll see you in hell first," says Eddie. And before me and my partner could do anything, Jamie had pulled out his gun and shot his brother dead. The ship gave a huge roll, and we all clung to our seats. In the steward's pantry there was a great clatter as bottles and glasses slid along a shelf. It was strange to hear that grim little story told by that mild old man. It was a story of another age, and you could hardly believe that this fat, red-faced little fellow with his silver fringe of hair, in a dinner jacket, 2 large pearls in his shirt front, had really taken part in it. "What happened then?" I asked. "We sobered up pretty quick. At first, Jamie couldn't believe Eddie was dead. He took him in his arms and kept calling him. 'Eddie,' he says, 'wake up, old boy, wake up.' He cried all night. The next day we rode in with him to town. 40 miles it was, me on one side of him and my partner on the other, and handed him over to the sheriff. I was crying too when we shook hands with him and said goodbye. I told my partner I'd never touch a card again or drink as long as I lived. And I never have. And I never will." Mr. Donaldson looked down, and his lips were trembling. He seemed to see again that scene of long ago. There was one thing I should have liked to ask him about, but he was evidently so much moved I did not like to. They seemed not to have hesitated, his partner and himself, but delivered up this wretched boy to justice as though it were the most natural thing in the world. It suggested that even in those rough, wild men, the respect for the law had somehow the force of an instinct. A little shiver ran through me. Mr. Donaldson emptied his glass of Vichy, and with a curt "good night," left us. "The old fellow's getting a bit childish," said Mr. Rosenbaum. "I don't believe he was ever very bright." "Well, apparently he was bright enough to make an awful lot of money. But how? In those days in California, you didn't want brains to make money. You only wanted luck. I know what I'm talking about. Johannesburg was the place where you had to have your wits about you. Joburg in the 80s. It was grand. We were a tough lot of guys, I can tell you. It was each for himself, and the devil take the hindmost." He took a meditative sip of his Vichy. "You talk of your cricket and baseball, your golf and tennis and football. You can have them. They're all very well for boys. Is it a reasonable thing, I ask you, for a grown man to run about and hit a ball? Poker's the only game fit for a grown man. Then your hand is against every man, and every man's hand is against yours. Teamwork? Whoever made a fortune by teamwork? There's only one way to make a fortune, and that's to down the fellow who's up against you." "I didn't know you were a poker player," I interrupted. "Why don't you take a hand one evening?" "I don't play any more. I've given it up too, but for the only reason a man should. I can't see myself giving it up because a friend of mine was unlucky enough to get killed. Anyway, a man who's damn fool enough to get killed isn't worth having as a friend. But in the old days, if you wanted to know what poker was, you ought to have been in South Africa then. It was the biggest game I've ever seen. And they were fine players. There wasn't a crooked dodge they weren't up to. It was grand. Just to give you an example, one night I was playing with some of the biggest men in Johannesburg, and I was called away. There was a couple of £1,000 in the pot. "Deal me a hand. I won't keep you waiting," I said. "All right," they said. "Don't hurry." Well, I wasn't gone more than a minute. When I came back, I picked up my cards and saw I'd got a straight flush to the queen. I didn't say a word. I just threw in my hand. I knew my company. And do you know? I was wrong. What do you mean? I don't understand. It was a perfectly straight deal, and the pot was 1 on 3/7. But how could I tell that? Naturally, I thought someone else had a straight flush to the king. It looked to me just the sort of hand I might lose £100,000 on. "Too bad," I said. I very nearly had a stroke, and it was on account of another pat straight flush that I gave up playing poker. I've only had about 5 in my life. I believe the chances are nearly 66,000 to 1 against. In San Francisco it was, the year before last. I'd been playing in a poor luck all evening. I hadn't lost much money because I never had a chance to play. I'd hardly had a pair, and if I got a pair, I couldn't improve. Then I got a hand just as bad as the others, and I didn't come in. The man next me wasn't playing either, and I showed him my hand. "That's the kind of thing I've been getting all evening," I said. "How can anyone be expected to play with cards like that?" "Well, I don't know what more you want," he said, as he looked at them. "Most of us would be prepared to come in on a straight flush." "What's that?" I cried. I was trembling like a leaf. I looked at the cards again. I thought I had 2 or 3 little hearts and 2 or 3 little diamonds. It was a straight flush in the hearts, all right, and I hadn't seen it. My eyes, it was. I knew what it meant. Old age. I don't cry much. I'm not that sort of man. But I couldn't help it then. I tried to control myself, but the tears just rolled down my cheeks. Then I got up. "I'm through, gentlemen," I said. "When a man's eyes are so dim that he can't see a straight flush when it's dealt him, he has no business to play poker. Nature's given me a hint, and I'm taking it. I'll never play poker again as long as I live." I cashed in my chips, all but one, and I left the house. I've never played since. Mr. Rosenbaum took a chip out of his waistcoat pocket and showed it to me. "I kept this as a souvenir. I always carry it about with me. I'm a sentimental old fool, I know that. But, you see, poker was the only thing I cared for. Now I've only got one thing left." "What is that?" I asked. A smile flickered across his cunning little face, and behind his thick glasses his roomy eyes twinkled with ironic glee. He looked incredibly astute and malicious. He gave the thin, high-pitched cackle of an old man amused, and answered with a single word, "Philanthropy."
The Verger by William Somerset Maugham. There had been a christening that afternoon at St. Peter's, Neville Square, and Albert Edward Foreman still wore his verger's gown. He kept his new one, its folds as full and stiff as though it were made not of alpaca, but of perennial bronze, for funerals and weddings. St. Peter's, Neville Square, was a church much favoured by the fashionable for these ceremonies, and now he wore only his second best. He wore it with complacence, for it was the dignified symbol of his office, and without it, when he took it off to go home, he had the disconcerting sensation of being somewhat insufficiently clad. He took pains with it. He pressed it and ironed it himself. During the 16 years he had been verger of this church, he had had a succession of such gowns, but he had never been able to throw them away when they were worn out, and the complete series, neatly wrapped up in brown paper, lay in the bottom drawers of the wardrobe in his bedroom. The verger busied himself quietly, replacing the painted wooden cover on the marble font, taking away a chair that had been brought for an infirm old lady, and waited for the vicar to have finished in the vestry so that he could tidy up in there and go home. Presently he saw him walk across the chancel, genuflect in front of the high altar, and come down the aisle. But he still wore his cassock. "What's he hanging about for?" the verger said to himself. "Don't he know I want my tea?" The vicar had been but recently appointed, a red-faced, energetic man in the early 40s, and Albert Edward still regretted his predecessor, a clergyman of the old school, who preached leisurely sermons in a silvery voice, and dined out a great deal with his more aristocratic parishioners. He liked things in church to be just so, but he never fussed. He was not like this new man, who wanted to have his finger in every pie. But Albert Edward was tolerant. St. Peter's was in a very good neighbourhood, and the parishioners were a very nice class of people. The new vicar had come from the East End, and he couldn't be expected to fall in all at once with the discreet ways of his fashionable congregation. "All this hustle," said Albert Edward. "But give him time, he'll learn." When the vicar had walked down the aisle so far that he could address the verger without raising his voice more than was becoming in a place of worship, he stopped.
"Foreman, will you come into the vestry for a minute? I have something to say to you."
"Very good, sir." The vicar waited for him to come up, and they walked up the church together. "A very nice christening, I thought, sir. Funny how the baby stopped crying the moment you took him."
"I've noticed they very often do,"
said the vicar with a little smile.
"After all, I've had a good deal of practice with them."
It was a source of subdued pride to him that he could nearly always quiet a whimpering infant by the manner in which he held it, and he was not unconscious of the amused admiration with which mothers and nurses watched him settle the baby in the crook of his surpliced arm. The verger knew that it pleased him to be complimented on his talent. The vicar preceded Albert Edward into the vestry. Albert Edward was a trifle surprised to find the two churchwardens there. He had not seen them come in. They gave him pleasant nods. "Good afternoon, my lord. Good afternoon, sir," he said to one after the other. They were elderly men, both of them, and they had been churchwardens almost as long as Albert Edward had been a verger. They were now sitting at a handsome refectory table that the old vicar had brought many years before from Italy, and the vicar sat down in the vacant chair between them. Albert Edward faced them, the table between him and them, and wondered with slight uneasiness what was the matter. He remembered still the occasion on which the organist had got into trouble, and the bother they had all had to hush things up. In a church like St. Peter's, Neville Square, they couldn't afford a scandal. On the vicar's red face was a look of resolute benignity, but the others bore an expression that was slightly troubled. "He's been nagging them, he has," said the verger to himself.
He's jockeyed them into doing something they don't half like it. That's what it is. You mark my words.
But his thoughts did not appear on Albert Edward's clean-cut and distinguished features. He stood in a respectful but not obsequious attitude. He had been in service before he was appointed to his ecclesiastical office, but only in very good houses, and his deportment was irreproachable. Starting as a page-boy in the household of a merchant prince, he had risen by due degrees from the position of fourth to first footman. For a year he had been single-handed butler to a widowed peeress, and, till the vacancy occurred at St. Peter's, butler with 2 men under him in the house of a retired ambassador. He was tall, spare, grave, and dignified. He looked, if not like a duke, at least like an actor of the old school who specialized in dukes' parts. He had tact, firmness, and self-assurance. His character was unimpeachable. The vicar began briskly.
"Foreman, we've got something rather unpleasant to say to you. You've been here a great many years, and I think his lordship and the general agree with me that you fulfil the duties of your office to the satisfaction of everybody concerned."
The 2 churchwardens nodded.
"But a most extraordinary circumstance came to my knowledge the other day, and I felt it my duty to impart it to the churchwardens. I discovered to my astonishment that you could neither read nor write."
The verger's face betrayed no sign of embarrassment.
The last vicar knew that, sir, he replied. He said it didn't make no difference. He always said there was a great deal too much education in the world for his taste. "It's the most amazing thing I ever heard," cried the general. "Do you mean to say that you've been verger of this church for 16 years and never learned to read or write?" "I went into service when I was 12, sir. The cook in the first place tried to teach me once, but I didn't seem to have the knack for it. And then what with one thing or another, I never seemed to have the time. I never really found the want of it. I think a lot of these young fellows waste a rare lot of time reading when they might be doing something useful." "But don't you want to know the news?" said the other churchwarden. "Don't you ever want to write a letter?" "No, me lord. I seem to manage very well without, and of late years now. They've all these pictures in the papers. I get to know what's going on pretty well. My wife's quite a scholar, and if I want to write a letter, she writes it for me. It's not as if I was a betting man."
The 2 churchwardens gave the vicar a troubled glance, and then looked down at the table.
"Well, Foreman, I've talked the matter over with these gentlemen, and they quite agree with me that the situation is impossible. At a church like St. Peter's, Neville Square, we cannot have a verger who can neither read nor write."
Albert Edward's thin, sallow face reddened, and he moved uneasily on his feet, but he made no reply.
"Understand me, Foreman. I have no complaint to make against you. You do your work quite satisfactorily. I have the highest opinion both of your character and of your capacity. But we haven't the right to take the risk of some accident that might happen, owing to your lamentable ignorance. It's a matter of prudence as well as of principle."
"But couldn't you learn, Foreman?" asked the general. "No, sir, I'm afraid I couldn't. Not now. You see, I'm not as young as I was, and if I couldn't seem able to get the letters in me head when I was a nipper, I don't think there's much chance of it now."
"We don't want to be harsh with you, Foreman,"
said the vicar,
"but the churchwardens and I have quite made up our minds. We'll give you 3 months, and if at the end of that time you cannot read and write, I'm afraid you'll have to go."
Albert Edward had never liked the new vicar. He'd said from the beginning that they'd made a mistake when they gave him St. Peter's. He wasn't the type of man they wanted with a classy congregation like that. And now he straightened himself a little. He knew his value, and he wasn't going to allow himself to be put upon.
"I'm very sorry, sir. I'm afraid it's no good. I'm too old a dog to learn new tricks. I've lived a good many years without knowing how to read and write, and without wishing to praise myself. Self-praise is no recommendation. I don't mind saying I've done my duty in that state of life in which it is pleased a merciful Providence to place me, and if I could learn now, I don't know as I'd want to.
In that case, Foreman, I'm afraid you must go.
Yes, sir. I quite understand. I shall be happy to hand in my resignation as soon as you've found somebody to take my place.
But when Albert Edward, with his usual politeness, had closed the church door behind the vicar and the 2 churchwardens, he could not sustain the air of unruffled dignity with which he had borne the blow inflicted upon him, and his lips quivered. He walked slowly back to the vestry and hung up on its proper peg his Verger's gown. He sighed as he thought of all the grand funerals and smart weddings it had seen. He tidied everything up, put on his coat, and hat in hand walked down the aisle. He locked the church door behind him. He strolled across the square. But deep in his sad thoughts he did not take the street that led him home, where a nice strong cup of tea awaited him. He took the wrong turning. He walked slowly along. His heart was heavy. He did not know what he should do with himself. He did not fancy the notion of going back to domestic service. After being his own master for so many years, for the vicar and churchwardens could say what they liked, it was he that had run St. Peter's, Neville Square. He could scarcely demean himself by accepting a situation. He had saved a tidy sum, but not enough to live on without doing something, and life seemed to cost more every year. He had never thought to be troubled with such questions. The Vergers of St. Peter's, like the popes of Rome, were there for life. He had often thought of the pleasant reference the vicar would make in his sermon at evensong, the first Sunday after his death, to the long and faithful service, and the exemplary character of their late Verger, Albert Edward Foreman. He sighed deeply. Albert Edward was a non-smoker and a total abstainer, but with a certain latitude. That is to say, he liked a glass of beer with his dinner, and when he was tired, he enjoyed a cigarette. It occurred to him now that one would comfort him, and since he did not carry them, he looked about for a shop where he could buy a packet of gold flakes. He did not at once see one, and walked on a little. It was a long street, with all sorts of shops in it. But there was not a single one where you could buy cigarettes.
"That's strange," said Albert Edward.
To make sure, he walked right up the street again. No, there was no doubt about it. He stopped and looked reflectively up and down.
"I can't be the only man as walks along this street and wants a cigarette," he said. "I shouldn't wonder but what a fellow might do very well with a little shop here. Tobacco and sweets, you know."
He gave a sudden start.
"What's an idea?" he said. "Strange how things come to you when you least expect it."
He turned, walked home, and had his tea.
"You're very silent this afternoon, Albert,"
his wife remarked.
"I'm thinking," he said.
He considered the matter from every point of view, and next day he went along the street and by good luck found a little shop to let that looked as though it would exactly suit him. 24 hours later he had taken it, and when a month after that he left St. Peter's, Neville Square, forever, Albert Edward Foreman set up in business as a tobacconist and news agent. His wife said it was a dreadful come-down after being Verger of St. Peter's, but he answered that you had to move with the times. The church wasn't what it was, and, henceforth, he was going to render unto Caesar what was Caesar's. Albert Edward did very well. He did so well that in a year or so it struck him that he might take a second shop and put a manager in. He looked for another long street that hadn't got a tobacconist in it, and when he found it, and a shop to let, took it and stocked it. This was a success too. Then it occurred to him that if he could run 2, he could run half a dozen. So he began walking about London, and whenever he found a long street that had no tobacconist and a shop to let, he took it. In the course of 10 years he had acquired no less than 10 shops, and he was making money hand over fist. He went round to all of them himself every Monday, collected the week's takings, and took them to the bank. One morning, when he was there, paying in a bundle of notes and a heavy bag of silver, the cashier told him that the manager would like to see him. He was shown into an office, and the manager shook hands with him.
Mr. Foreman, I wanted to have a talk with you about the money you've got on deposit with us. Do you know exactly how much it is?
Not within £1 or 2, sir, but I've got a pretty rough idea.
Apart from what you paid in this morning, it's a little over £30,000. That's a very large sum to have on deposit, and I should have thought you'd do better to invest it.
I wouldn't want to take no risk, sir. I know it's safe in the bank.
Well, you needn't have the least anxiety. We'll make you out a list of absolutely gilt-edged securities. They'll bring you in a better rate of interest than we can possibly afford to give you.
A troubled look settled on Mr. Foreman's distinguished face.
I've never had anything to do with stocks and shares, and I'd have to leave it all in your hands, he said.
The manager smiled.
We'll do everything. All you'll have to do next time you come in is just to sign the transfers.
Oh, I could do that all right, said Albert uncertainly. But how should I know what I was signing?
Well, I suppose you can read,
said the manager a trifle sharply. Mr. Foreman gave him a disarming smile.
Well, sir, that's just it. I can't. I know it sounds funny like, but there it is. I can't read all right, only me name, and I only learnt to do that when I went into business.
The manager was so surprised that he jumped up from his chair.
That's the most extraordinary thing I ever heard.
You see, it's like this, I never had the opportunity until it was too late, and then somehow I wouldn't. I get obstinate like.
The manager stared at him as though he were a prehistoric monster.
And you mean to say that you built up this important business and amassed a fortune of £30,000 without being able to read or write? Good God, man, what would you be now if you had been able to?
Oh, I can tell you that, sir, said Mr. Foreman, a little smile on his still aristocratic features. I'd be Verger of St. Peter's, Neville Square.
The Wash Tub by William Somerset Maugham. Positano stands on the side of a steep hill, a disarray of huddled white houses, their tiled roofs washed pale by the suns of 100 years. But unlike many of these Italian towns perched out of harm's way on a rocky eminence, it does not offer you at one delightful glance all it has to give. It has quaint streets that zigzag up the hill, and battered painted houses in the Baroque style, but very late, in which Neapolitan noblemen led for a season lives of penurious grandeur. It is indeed almost excessively picturesque, and in winter its 2 or 3 modest hotels are crowded with painters, male and female, who in their different ways acknowledge by their daily labours the emotion it has excited in them. Some take infinite pains to place on canvas every window and every tile their peering eyes can discover, and doubtless achieve the satisfaction that rewards honest industry. At all events, it's sincere, they say modestly when they show you their work. Some, rugged and dashing, in a fine frenzy, attack their canvas with a palette knife charged with a wad of paint, and they say, "You see, what I was trying to bring out was my personality." They slightly close their eyes and tentatively murmur, "I think it's rather me, don't you?" And there are some who give you highly entertaining arrangements of spheres and cubes, and utter somberly, "That's how I see it." These, for the most part, are strong, silent men who waste no words. But Positano looks full south, and the chances are that in summer you will have it to yourself. The hotel is clean and cool, and there is a terrace overhung with vines where you can sit at night and look at the sea bespangled with dim stars. Down at the marina, on the quay, is a little tavern where you can dine under an archway off anchovies and ham, macaroni and fresh-caught mullet, and drink cold wine. Once a day the steamer from Naples comes in, bringing the mail, and for a quarter of an hour gives the beach, there is no port and the passengers are landed in small boats, an air of animation. One August, tiring of Capri, where I had been staying, I made up my mind to spend a few days at Positano, so I hired a fishing boat and rowed over. I stopped on the way in a shady cove to bathe and lunch and sleep, and did not arrive till evening. I strolled up the hill, my 2 bags following me on the heads of 2 sturdy women, to the hotel, and was surprised to learn that I was not its only guest. The waiter, whose name was Giuseppe, was an old friend of mine, and at that season he was boots, porter, chambermaid, and cook as well. He told me that an American signore had been staying there for 3 months. "Is he a painter, or a writer, or something?" I asked.
"No, signore. He's a gentleman."
Odd, I thought. No foreigners came to Positano at that time of year, but German Wandervögel, looking hot and dusty, with satchels on their backs, and they only stayed overnight. I could not imagine anyone wishing to spend 3 months there, unless, of course, he were hiding. And since all London had been excited by the flight earlier in the year of an eminent but dishonest financier, the amusing thought occurred to me that this mysterious stranger was perhaps he. I knew him slightly, and trusted that my sudden arrival would not disconcert him.
"You'll see the signore at the marina,"
said Giuseppe as I was setting out to go down again.
"He always dines there."
He was certainly not there when I arrived. I asked what there was for dinner, and drank an Americano, which is by no means a bad substitute for a cocktail. In a few minutes, however, a man walked in who could be no other than my fellow guest at the hotel, and I had a moment's disappointment when I saw that it was not the absconding financier. A tall, elderly man, bronzed after his summer on the Mediterranean, with a handsome, thin face. He wore a very neat, even smart, suit of cream-coloured silk, and no hat. His grey hair was cut very short, but was still thick. There was ease in his bearing, and elegance. He looked round the half-dozen tables under the archway at which the natives of the place were playing cards or dominoes, and his eyes rested on me. They smiled pleasantly. He came up. "I hear you have just arrived at the hotel. Giuseppe suggested that as he couldn't come down here to effect an introduction, you wouldn't mind if I introduced myself. Would it bore you to dine with a total stranger?" "Of course not. Sit down." He turned to the maid, who was laying a cover for me, and in beautiful Italian told her that I would eat with him. He looked at my Americano. "I have got them to stock a little gin and French vermouth for me. Would you allow me to mix you a very dry martini?" without hesitation. "It gives an exotic note to the surroundings which brings out the local colour." He certainly made a very good cocktail, and with added appetite we ate the ham and anchovies with which our dinner began. My host had a pleasant humour, and his fluent conversation was agreeable. "You must forgive me if I talk too much," he said presently. "This is the first chance I've had to speak English for 3 months. I don't suppose you will stay here long, and I mean to make the most of it." 3 months is a long time to stay at Positano. "I've hired a boat, and I bathe and fish. I read a great deal. I have a good many books here, and if there's anything I can lend you, I shall be very glad." "I think I have enough reading matter, but I should love to look at what you have. It's always fun to look at other people's books." He gave me a sharp look, and his eyes twinkled. "It also tells you a good deal about them," he murmured. When we finished dinner, we went on talking. The stranger was well read and interested in a diversity of topics. He spoke with so much knowledge of painting that I wondered if he was an art critic or a dealer. But then it appeared that he had been reading Suetonius, and I came to the conclusion that he was a college professor. I asked him his name. "Barnaby," he answered. "That's a name that has recently acquired an amazing celebrity." "Oh, how so?" "Have you never heard of the celebrated Mrs. Barnaby? She's a compatriot of yours." "I admit that I've seen her name in the papers rather frequently of late. Do you know her?" "Yes, quite well. She gave the grandest parties all last season, and I went to them whenever she asked me. Everyone did. She's an astounding woman. She came to London to do the season, and by George, she did it. She just swept everything before her." "I understand she's very rich?" "Fabulously, I believe. But it's not that has made her success. Plenty of American women have money. Mrs. Barnaby has got where she has by sheer force of character. She never pretends to be anything but what she is. She's natural. She's priceless. You know her history, of course?" My friend smiled. "Mrs. Barnaby may be a great celebrity in London, but to the best of my belief in America she's almost inconceivably unknown." I smiled also, but within me. I could well imagine how shocked this distinguished and cultured man would be by the rollicking humour, the frankness with its tang of the soil, and the rich and vital experience of the amazing Mrs. Barnaby. Well, I'll tell you about her. Her husband appears to be a very rough diamond. He's a great hulking fellow, she says, who could fell a steer with his fist. He's known in Arizona as One Bullet Mike. "Good gracious, why?" "Well, years ago, in the old days, he killed 2 men with a single shot. She says he's handier with his gun even now than any man west of the Rockies. He's a miner, but he's been a cowpuncher, a gun runner, and God knows what in his day." "A thoroughly Western type," said my professor. "A trifle acidly, I thought. Something of a desperado, I imagine. Mrs. Barnaby's stories about him are a real treat. Of course everyone's been begging her to let him come over, but she says he'd never leave the wide-open spaces. He struck oil a year or 2 ago, and now he's got all the money in the world. He must be a great character. I've heard her keep the whole dinner table spellbound when she's talked of the old days when they roughed it together. It gives you quite a thrill when you see this grey-haired woman, not at all pretty, but exquisitely dressed, with the most wonderful pearls, and hear her tell how she washed the miners' clothes and cooked for the camp. Your American women have an adaptability that's really stupendous. When you see Mrs. Barnaby sitting at the head of her table, perfectly at home with princes of the blood, ambassadors, cabinet ministers, and the Duke of this and the Duke of that, it seems almost incredible that only a few years ago she was cooking the food of 70 miners. Can she read or write? I suppose her invitations are written by her secretary, but she's by no means an ignorant woman. She told me she used to make a point of reading for an hour every night after the fellows in camp had gone to bed. Remarkable. On the other hand, One Bullet Mike only learnt to write his name when he suddenly found himself under the necessity of signing cheques. We walked up the hill to our hotel, and before separating for the night, arranged to take our luncheon with us next day, and row over to a cove that my friend had discovered. We spent a charming day, bathing, reading, eating, sleeping, and talking, and we dined together in the evening. The following morning, after breakfast on the terrace, I reminded Barnaby of his promise to show me his books. "Come right along." I accompanied him to his bedroom, where Giuseppe, the waiter, was making his bed. The first thing I caught sight of was a photograph in a gorgeous frame of the celebrated Mrs. Barnaby. My friend caught sight of it too, and suddenly turned pale with anger. "You fool, Giuseppe! Why have you taken that photograph out of my wardrobe? Why the devil did you think I put it away?"
"I didn't know, signore. That's why he put it back on the signore's table. I thought he'd like to see the portrait of his signora."
I was staggered. "Is my Mrs. Barnaby your wife?" I cried. "She is." "Good Lord! Are you one-bullet Mike?" "Do I look it?" I began to laugh. "I'm bound to say you don't." I glanced at his hands. He smiled grimly and held them out. "No, sir, I've never felled a steer with my naked fist." For a moment we stared at one another in silence. "She'll never forgive me," he moaned. "She wanted me to take a false name, and when I wouldn't, she was quite vexed with me. She said it wasn't safe. I said it was bad enough to hide myself in Positano for 3 months, but I'd be damned if I'd use any other name than my own." He hesitated. "I throw myself on your mercy. I can do nothing but trust to your generosity not to disclose a secret that you have discovered by the most unlikely chance." "I will be as silent as the grave. But honestly, I don't understand. What does it all mean?" "I am a doctor by profession, and for the last 30 years my wife and I have lived in Pennsylvania. I don't know if I have struck you as a roughneck, but I venture to say that Mrs. Barnaby is one of the most cultivated women I have ever known. Then a cousin of hers died and left her a very large fortune. There's no mistake about that. My wife is a very, very rich woman. She's always read a great deal of English fiction, and her one desire was to have a London season and entertain and do all the grand things she'd read about in books. It was her money, and although the prospect did not particularly tempt me, I was very glad that she should gratify her wish. We sailed last April. The young Duke and Duchess of Hereford happened to be on board." "I know. It was they who first launched Mrs. Barnaby. They were crazy about her. They've boomed her like an army of press agents." "I was ill when we sailed. I had a carbuncle which confined me to my stateroom, and Mrs. Barnaby was left to look after herself. Her deck chair happened to be next the Duchess's, and from a remark she overheard it occurred to her that the English aristocracy were not so wrapped up in our social leaders as one might have expected. My wife is a quick little woman, and she remarked to me that if you had an ancestor who signed Magna Carta, perhaps you were not excessively impressed because the grandfather of one of your acquaintances sold skunks, and the grandfather of another ran ferry boats. My wife has a very keen sense of humour. Getting into conversation with the Duchess, she told her a little Western anecdote, and to make it more interesting, told it as having happened to herself. Its success was immediate. The Duchess begged for another, and my wife ventured a little further. 24 hours later she had the Duke and Duchess eating out of her hand. She used to come down to my stateroom at intervals and tell me of her progress. In the innocence of my heart I was tickled to death, and since I had nothing else to do, I sent to the library for the works of Bret Harte and primed her with effective touches. I slapped my forehead. "We said she was as good as Bret Harte," I cried. I had a grand time thinking of the consternation of my wife's friends when at the end of the voyage I appeared and we told them the truth. But I reckoned without my wife. The day before we reached Southampton, Mrs. Barnaby told me that the Herefords were arranging parties for her. The Duchess was crazy to introduce her to all sorts of wonderful people. It was a chance in 1,000, but of course I should spoil everything. She admitted that she had been forced by the course of events to represent me as very different from what I was. I did not know that she had already transformed me into one-bullet Mike, but I had a shrewd suspicion that she'd forgotten to mention that I was on board. Well, to make a long story short, she asked me to go to Paris for a week or two till she had consolidated her position. I didn't mind that. I was much more inclined to do a little work at the Sorbonne than to go to parties at Mayfair, and so leaving her to go to Southampton, I got off at Cherbourg. But when I had been in Paris 10 days, she flew over to see me. She told me that her success had exceeded her wildest dreams. It was 10 times more wonderful than any of the novels. But my appearance would ruin it all. Very well, I said I would stay in Paris. She didn't like the idea of that. She said she'd never have a moment's peace so long as I was so near, and I might run across someone who knew me. I suggested Vienna or Rome. They wouldn't do either, and at last I came here, and here have I been hiding like a criminal for 3 interminable months. Do you mean to say you never killed the 2 gamblers, shooting one with your right hand and the other with your left? Sir, I have never fired a pistol in my life. And what about the attack on your log cabin by the Mexican bandits, when your wife loaded your guns for you, and you stood the siege for 3 days till the Federal troops rescued you? Mr. Barnaby smiled grimly. I never heard that one. Isn't it a trifle crude? Crude? It was as good as any Wild West picture. If I may venture a guess, that's where my wife, in all probability, got the idea. But the wash-tub, washing the miners' clothes and all that, you don't know how she made us roar with that story. Why, she swam into London society in her wash-tub. I began to laugh. She's made the most gorgeous fools of us all, I said. She's made a pretty considerable fool of me, I would have you observe, remarked Mr. Barnaby. She's a marvellous woman, and you're right to be proud of her. I always said she was priceless. She realized the passion for romance that beats in every British heart, and she's given us exactly what we wanted. I wouldn't betray her for worlds. It's all very fine for you, sir. London may have gained a wonderful hostess, but I'm beginning to think that I have lost a perfectly good wife. The only thing for one bullet, Mike, is the great open West. My dear Mr. Barnaby, there is only one course open to you now. You must continue to disappear. I'm very much obliged to you. I thought he replied with a good deal of acidity. The Social Sense by William Somerset Maugham. I do not like long-standing engagements. How can you tell whether on a certain day, 3 or 4 weeks ahead, you will wish to dine with a certain person? The chances are that in the interval something will turn up that you would much sooner do, and so long a notice presages a large and formal party. But what help is there? The date has been fixed thus far away so that the guests bidden may be certainly disengaged, and it needs a very adequate excuse to prevent your refusal from seeming churlish. You accept, and for a month the engagement hangs over you with gloomy menace. It interferes with your cherished plans. It disorganizes your life. There is really only one way to cope with the situation, and that is to put yourself off at the last moment. But it is one that I have never had the courage or the want of scruple to adopt. It was with a faint sense of resentment, then, that one June evening, towards 8:30, I left my lodgings in Half Moon Street to walk round the corner to dine with the MacDonalds. I liked them. Many years ago I made up my mind not to eat the food of persons I disliked or despised, and though I have on this account enjoyed the hospitality of far fewer people than I otherwise should have done, I still think the rule a good one. The MacDonalds were nice, but their parties were a toss-up. They suffered from the delusion that if they asked 6 persons to dine with them who had nothing in the world to say to one another, the party would be a failure. But if they multiplied it by 3 and asked 18, it must be a success. I arrived a little late, which is almost inevitable when you live so near the house you're going to that it is not worthwhile to take a taxi, and the room into which I was shown was filled with people. I knew few of them, and my heart sank as I saw myself laboriously making conversation through a long dinner with two total strangers. It was a relief to me when I saw Thomas and Mary Wharton come in, and an unexpected pleasure when I found on going in to dinner that I had been placed next to Mary. Thomas Wharton was a portrait painter who at one time had had considerable success, but he had never fulfilled the promise of his youth and had long ceased to be taken seriously by the critics. He made an adequate income, but at the private view of the Royal Academy no one gave more than a passing glance at the dull but conscientious portraits of fox-hunting squires and prosperous merchants which, with unfailing regularity, he sent to the annual exhibition. One would have liked to admire his work because he was an amiable and kindly man. If you happened to be a writer, he was so genuinely enthusiastic over anything you had done, so charmed with any success you might have had, that you wished your conscience would allow you to speak with decent warmth of his own productions. It was impossible, and you were driven to the last refuge of the portrait painter's friend. "It looks as if it were a marvellous likeness," you said. Mary Wharton had been in her day a well-known concert singer, and she had still the remains of a lovely voice. She must in her youth have been very handsome. Now, at 53, she had a haggard look. Her features were rather mannish, and her skin was weather-beaten, but her short grey hair was thick and curly, and her fine eyes were bright with intelligence. She dressed picturesquely rather than fashionably, and she had a weakness for strings of beads and fantastic earrings. She had a blunt manner, a quick sense of human folly, and a sharp tongue, so that many people did not like her. But no one could deny that she was clever. She was not only an accomplished musician, but she was a great reader, and she was passionately interested in painting. She had a very rare feeling for art. She liked the modern, not from pose, but from natural inclination, and she had bought for next to nothing the pictures of unknown painters who later became famous. You heard at her house the most recent and difficult music, and no poet or novelist in Europe could offer the world something new and strange without her being ready to fight on his behalf the good fight against the Philistines. You might say she was a highbrow. She was. But her taste was almost faultless, her judgment sound, and her enthusiasm honest. No one admired her more than Thomas Wharton. He had fallen in love with her when she was still a singer, and had pestered her to marry him. She had refused him half a dozen times, and I had a notion that she had married him in the end with hesitation. She thought that he would become a great painter, and when he turned out to be no more than a decent craftsman, without originality or imagination, she felt that she had been cheated. She was mortified by the contempt with which the connoisseurs regarded him. Thomas Wharton loved his wife. He had the greatest respect for her judgment, and would sooner have had a word of praise from her than columns of eulogy in all the papers in London. She was too honest to say what she did not think. It wounded him bitterly that she held his work in such poor esteem, and though he pretended to make a joke of it, you could see that at heart he resented her outspoken comments. Sometimes his long, horse-like face grew red with the anger he tried to control, and his dark eyes with hatred. It was notorious among their friends that the couple did not get on. They had the distressing habit of fripping in public. Wharton never spoke to others of Mary but with admiration, but she was less discreet, and her confidants knew how exasperating she found them. She admitted his goodness, his generosity, his unselfishness. She admitted them ungrudgingly. But his defects were of the sort that make a man hard to live with, for he was narrow, argumentative, and conceited. He was not an artist, and Mary Wharton cared more for art than for anything in the world. It was a matter on which she could not compromise. It blinded her to the fact that the faults in Wharton that maddened her were due in large part to his hurt feelings. She wounded him continually, and he was dogmatic and intolerant in self-protection. There cannot be anything much worse than to be despised by the one person whose approval is all in all to you. And though Thomas Wharton was intolerable, it was impossible not to feel sorry for him. But if I have given the impression that Mary was a discontented, rather tiresome, pretentious woman, I have been unjust to her. She was a loyal friend and a delightful companion. You could talk to her of any subject under the sun. Her conversation was humorous and witty. Her vitality was immense. She was sitting now on the left hand of her host, and the talk around her was general. I was occupied with my next-door neighbour, but I guessed by the laughter with which Mary's sallies were greeted that she was at her brilliant best. When she was in the vein, no one could approach her. "You're in great form tonight," I remarked, when at last she turned to me.
"Does it surprise you?"
"No, it's what I expect of you. No wonder people tumble over one another to get you to their houses. You have the inestimable gift of making a party go."
"I do my little best to earn my dinner."
"By the way, how's Manson? Someone told me the other day that he was going into a nursing home for an operation. I hope it's nothing serious." Mary paused for a moment before answering, but she still smiled brightly.
"Haven't you seen the paper tonight?"
"No, I've been playing golf. I only got home in time to jump into a bath and change."
"He died at 2:00 this afternoon."
I was about to make an exclamation of horrified surprise, but she stopped me.
"Take care. Tom is watching me like a lynx. They're all watching me. They all know I adored him, but they none of them know for certain if he was my lover. Even Tom doesn't know. They want to see how I'm taking it. Try to look as if you were talking of the Russian ballet."
At that moment someone addressed her from the other side of the table, and throwing back her head a little with a gesture that was habitual with her, a smile on her large mouth, she flung at the speaker so quick and apt an answer that everyone round her burst out laughing. The talk once more became general, and I was left to my consternation. I knew, everyone knew, that for 25 years there had existed between Gerard Manson and Mary Wharton a passionate attachment. It had lasted so long that even the more straight-laced of their friends, if ever they had been shocked by it, had long since learned to accept it with tolerance. They were middle-aged people. Manson was 60, and Mary not much younger, and it was absurd that at their age they should not do what they liked. You met them sometimes sitting in a retired corner of an obscure restaurant, or walking together in the zoo, and you wondered why they still took care to conceal an affair that was nobody's business but their own. But of course there was Thomas. He was insanely jealous of Mary. He made many violent scenes, and indeed, at the end of one tempestuous period, not so very long ago, he forced her to promise never to see Manson again. Of course, she broke the promise, and though she knew that Thomas suspected this, she took precautions to prevent him from discovering it for a fact. It was hard on Thomas. I think he and Mary would have jogged on well enough together, and she would have resigned herself to the fact that he was a second-rate painter if her intercourse with Manson had not embittered her judgment. The contrast between her husband's mediocrity and her lover's brilliance was too galling.
"With Tom, I feel as if I were stifling in a closed room full of dusty knickknacks," she told me. "With Gerard, I breathe the pure air of the mountain-tops."
"Is it possible for a woman to fall in love with a man's mind?" I asked in a pure spirit of inquiry.
"What else is there in Gerard?"
That, I admit, was a poser. For my part, I thought nothing. But the sex is extraordinary. and I was quite ready to believe that Mary saw in Gerard Manson a charm and a physical attractiveness to which most people were blind. He was a shriveled little man with a pale, intellectual face, faded blue eyes behind his spectacles, and a high dome of shiny bald head. He had none of the appearance of a romantic lover. On the other hand, he was certainly a very subtle critic and a felicitous essayist. I resented somewhat his contemptuous attitude towards English writers unless they were safely dead and buried, but this was only to his credit with the intelligentsia, who are ever ready to believe that there can be no good in what is produced in their own country, and with them his influence was great. On one occasion I told him that he had only to put a commonplace in French for him to mistake it for an epigram, and he had thought well enough of the joke to use it as his own in one of his essays. He reserved such praise as he was willing to accord his contemporaries to those who wrote in a foreign tongue. The exasperating thing was that no one could deny that he was himself a brilliant writer. His style was exquisite. His knowledge was vast. He could be profound without pomposity, amusing without frivolity, and polished without affectation. His slightest article was readable. His essays were little masterpieces. For my part, I did not find him a very agreeable companion. Perhaps I did not get the best out of him. Though I knew him a great many years, I never heard him say an amusing thing. He was not talkative, and when he made a remark, it was oracular. The prospect of spending an evening alone with him would have filled me with dismay. It never ceased to puzzle me that this dull and mannered little man should be able to write with so much grace, wit, and gaiety. It puzzled me even more that a gallant and vivacious creature like Mary Wharton should have cherished for him so consuming a passion. These things are inexplicable, and there was evidently something in that odd, crabbed, irascible creature that appealed to women. His wife adored him. She was a fat, frowsy, boring person. She had led Gerard a dog's life, but had always refused to give him his freedom. She swore to kill herself if he left her, and since she was unbalanced and hysterical, he was never quite certain that she would not carry out her threat. One day, when I was having tea with Mary, I saw that she was distraught and nervous, and when I asked her what was the matter, she burst into tears. She'd been lunching with Manson and had found him shattered after a terrific scene with his wife.
"We can't go on like this," Mary cried. "It's ruining his life. It's ruining all our lives."
"Why don't you take the plunge?"
"What do you mean?"
"You've been lovers so long. You know the best and the worst of one another by now. You're getting old, and you can't count on many more years of life. It seems a pity to waste a love that has endured so long. What good are you doing to Mrs. Manson or to Tom? Are they happy because you two are making yourselves miserable?"
"No."
"Then why don't you chuck everything and just go off together and let come what may?" Mary shook her head.
"We've talked that over endlessly. We've talked it over for a quarter of a century. It's impossible. For years Gerard couldn't on account of his daughters. Mrs. Manson may have been a very fond mother, but she was a very bad one, and there was no one to see the girls were properly brought up but Gerard. And now that they're married off, he's set in his habits. What should we do? Go to France or Italy? I couldn't tear Gerard away from his surroundings. He'd be wretched. He's too old to make a fresh start. And besides, though Thomas nags me and makes scenes and we frip and get on one another's nerves, he loves me. When it came to the point, I simply shouldn't have the heart to leave him. He'd be lost without me."
"It's a situation without an issue. I'm dreadfully sorry for you." On a sudden, Mary's haggard, weather-beaten face was lit up by a smile that broke on her large red mouth, and upon my word, at that moment she was beautiful.
"You need not be. I was rather low a little while ago, but now I've had a good cry I feel better." Notwithstanding all the pain, all the unhappiness this affair has caused me, I wouldn't have missed it for all the world. For those few moments of ecstasy my love has brought me, I would be willing to live all my life over again. And I think he'd tell you the same thing. Oh, it's been so infinitely worthwhile.
I could not help but be moved. There's no doubt about it, I said. That's love, all right.
Yes, it's love, and we've just got to go through with it. There's no way out.
Then now, with this tragic suddenness, the way out had come. I turned a little to look at Mary, and she, feeling my eyes upon her, turned too. There was a smile on her lips. Why did you come here tonight? It must be awful for you. She shrugged her shoulders.
What could I do? I read the news in the evening paper while I was dressing. He'd asked me not to ring up the nursing home on account of his wife. It's death to me. Death. I had to come. We'd been engaged for a month. What excuse could I give Tom? I'm not supposed to have seen Gerard for 2 years. Do you know that for 20 years we've written to one another every day?
Her lower lip trembled a little, but she bit it, and for a moment her face was twisted to a strange grimace. Then, with a smile, she pulled herself together.
He was everything I had in the world, but I couldn't let the party down, could I? He always said I had a social sense.
Happily, we shall break up early, and you can go home.
I don't want to go home. I don't want to be alone. I daren't cry because my eyes will get red and swollen when we've got a lot of people lunching with us tomorrow. Will you come, by the way? I want an extra man. I must be in good form. Tom expects to get a commission for a portrait out of it.
By George, you've got courage.
Do you think so? I'm heartbroken, you know. And I suppose that's what makes it easier for me. Gerard would have liked me to put a good face on it. He would have appreciated the irony of the situation. It's the sort of thing he always thought the French novelists described so well.
The Four Dutchmen by William Somerset Maugham. The Van Dorth Hotel at Singapore was far from grand. The bedrooms were dingy, and the mosquito nets patched and darned. The bathhouses, all in a row and detached from the bedrooms, were dank and smelly. But it had character. The people who stayed there, masters of tramps whose round ended at Singapore, mining engineers out of a job, and planters taking a holiday, to my mind bore a more romantic air than the smart folk, globe-trotters, government officials and their wives, wealthy merchants who gave luncheon parties at the Europe and played golf and danced and were fashionable. The Van Dorth had a billiard room with a table with a threadbare cloth, where ship's engineers and clerks in insurance offices played snooker. The dining room was large and bare and silent. Dutch families on the way to Sumatra ate solidly through their dinner without exchanging a word with one another, and single gentlemen on a business trip from Batavia devoured a copious meal while they intently read their paper. On 2 days a week there was rice tuffle, and then a few residents of Singapore who had a fancy for this dish came for tiffin. The Van Dorth Hotel should have been a depressing place, but somehow it wasn't. Its quaintness saved it. It had a faint aroma of something strange and half-forgotten. There was a scrap of garden facing the street where you could sit in the shade of trees and drink cold beer. In that crowded and busy city, though motors whizzed past and rickshaws passed continuously, the coolies' feet pattering on the road and their bells ringing, it had the remote peacefulness of a corner of Holland. It was the third time I had stayed at the Van Dorth. I had been told about it first by the skipper of a Dutch tramp, the SS Utrecht, on which I had travelled from Merauke in New Guinea to Macassar. The journey took the best part of a month, since the ship stopped at a number of islands in the Malay archipelago, the Aru and the Kei Islands, Banda Nera, Amboina, and others of which I have even forgotten the names, and sometimes for an hour or two, sometimes for a day, to take on or discharge cargo. It was a charming, monotonous, and diverting trip. When we dropped anchor, the agent came out in his launch, and generally the Dutch resident, and we gathered on deck under the awning, and the captain ordered beer. The news of the island was exchanged for the news of the world. We brought papers and mail. If we were staying long enough, the resident asked us to dinner, and leaving the ship in charge of the second officer, we all, the captain, the chief officer, the engineer, the supercargo, and I, piled into the launch and went ashore. We spent a merry evening. These little islands, one so like another, allured my fancy just because I knew that I should never see them again. It made them strangely unreal, and as we sailed away, and they vanished into the sea and sky, it was only by an effort of the imagination that I could persuade myself that they did not, with my last glimpse of them, cease to exist. But there was nothing elusive, mysterious, or fantastic about the captain, the chief officer, the chief engineer, and the supercargo. Their solidity was amazing. They were the four fattest men I ever saw. At first I had great difficulty in telling them apart, for though one, the supercargo, was dark and the others were fair, they looked astonishingly alike. They were all big, with large, round, bare, red faces, with large, fat arms, and large, fat legs, and large, fat bellies. When they went ashore, they buttoned up their stinger shifters, and then their great double chins bulged over the collars, and they looked as though they would choke. But generally they wore them unbuttoned. They sweated freely and wiped their shiny faces with bandanas and vigorously fanned themselves with palm-leaf fans. It was a treat to see them at tiffin. Their appetites were enormous. They had rice tafel every day, and each seemed to vie with the other how high he could pile his plate. They loved it hot and strong. "In this country, you can't eat a thing unless it's tasty," said the skipper. "The only way to keep yourself up in this country is to eat hearty," said the chief. They were the greatest friends, all four of them. They were like schoolboys together, playing absurd little pranks with one another. They knew each other's jokes by heart, and no sooner did one of them start the familiar lines than he would splutter with laughter so violently, the heavy, shaking laughter of the fat man, that he could not go on, and then the others began to laugh too. They rolled about in their chairs and grew redder and redder, hotter and hotter, till the skipper shouted for beer, and each, gasping but happy, drank his bottle in one enchanted draught. They had been on this run together for 5 years, and when, a little time before, the chief officer had been offered a ship of his own, he refused it. He would not leave his companions. They had made up their minds that when the first of them retired, they would all retire. "All friends and a good ship, good grub and good beer. What can a sensible man want more?" At first they were a little standoffish with me. Although the ship had accommodation for 6 passengers, they did not often get any, and never one whom they did not know. I was a stranger, and a foreigner. They liked their bit of fun, and did not want anyone to interfere with it. But they were all of them very fond of bridge, and on occasion the chief and the engineer had duties that prevented one or the other from playing. They were willing to put up with me when they discovered that I was ready to make a fourth whenever I was wanted. Their bridge was as incredibly fantastic as they were. They played for infinitesimal stakes, 5 cents 100. They did not want to win one another's money, they said. It was the game they liked. But what a game! Each was wildly determined to play the hand, and hardly one was dealt without at least a small slam being declared. The rule was that if you could get a peep at somebody else's cards, you did, and if you could get away with a revoke, you told your partner when there was no danger it could be claimed, and you both roared with laughter till the tears rolled down your fat cheeks. But if your partner had insisted on taking the bid away from you, and had called a grand slam on 5 spades to the queen, whereas you were positive on your 7 little diamonds you could have made it easily, you could always score him off by redoubling without a trick in your hand. He went down 2,000 or 3,000, and the glasses on the table danced with the laughter that shook your opponents. I could never remember their difficult Dutch names, but knowing them anonymously, as it were, only by the duties they performed, as one knows the characters Pantaloon, Harlequin, and Punchinello of the old Italian comedy, added grotesquely to their drollery. The mere sight of them, all 4 together, set you laughing, and I think they got a good deal of amusement from the astonishment they caused in strangers. They boasted that they were the 4 most famous Dutchmen in the East Indies. To me, not the least comic part of them was their serious side. Sometimes, late at night, when they had given up all pretense of still wearing their uniforms, and one or the other of them lay by my side on a long chair in a pyjama jacket and a sarong, he would grow sentimental. The chief engineer, due to retire soon, was meditating marriage with a widow whom he had met when last he was home, and spending the rest of his life in a little town with old red-brick houses on the shores of the Zuyder Zee. But the captain was very susceptible to the charms of the native girls, and his thick English became almost unintelligible from emotion when he described to me the effect they had on him. One of these days he would buy himself a house on the hills in Java and marry a pretty little Javanese. They were so small and so gentle, and they made no noise, and he would dress her in silk sarongs and give her gold chains to wear round her neck and gold bangles to put on her arms. But the chief mocked him. "Silly, all that is, silly. She goes with all your friends, and the houseboys, and everybody. By the time you retire, my dear, what you'll want will be a nurse, not a wife." "Me?" cried the skipper. "I shall want a wife when I'm 80. He had picked up a little thing last time the ship was at Macassar, and as we approached that port, he began to be all of a flutter. The chief officer shrugged fat and indulgent shoulders. The captain was always losing his head over one brazen hussy after another, but his passion never survived the interval between one stop at a port and the next, and then the chief was called in to smooth out the difficulties that ensued. And so it would be this time. The old man suffers from fatty degeneration of the heart, but so long as I'm there to look after him, not much harm comes of it. He wastes his money, and that's a pity. But as long as he's got it to waste, why shouldn't he?" The chief officer had a philosophic soul. At Macassar, then, I disembarked, and bade farewell to my 4 fat friends. "Make another journey with us," they said. "Come back next year, or the year after. You'll find us all here just the same as ever." A good many months had passed since then, and I had wandered through more than one strange land. I had been to Bali and Java and Sumatra. I had been to Cambodia and Annam. And now, feeling as though I were home again, I sat in the garden of the Van Dorth Hotel. It was cool in the very early morning, and having had breakfast, I was looking at back numbers of the Straits Times to find out what had been happening in the world since last I had been within reach of papers. Nothing very much. Suddenly my eyes caught a headline. The Utrecht Tragedy. Supercargo and Chief Engineer. Not guilty. I read the paragraph carelessly, and then I sat up. The Utrecht was the ship of my 4 fat Dutchmen, and apparently the supercargo and the chief engineer had been on trial for murder. It couldn't be my 2 fat friends. The names were given, but the names meant nothing to me. The trial had taken place in Batavia. No details were given in this paragraph. It was only a brief announcement that after the judges had considered the speeches of the prosecution and of the defense, their verdict was as stated. I was astounded. It was incredible that the men I knew could have committed a murder. I could not find out who had been murdered. I looked through back numbers of the paper. Nothing. I got up and went to the manager of the hotel, a genial Dutchman who spoke admirable English, and showed him the paragraph. That's the ship I sailed on. I was in her for nearly a month. Surely these fellows aren't the men I knew. The men I knew were enormously fat.
Yes, that's right, he answered. They were celebrated all through the Dutch East Indies, the 4 fattest men in the service. It's been a terrible thing. It made a great sensation. And they were friends. I knew them all. The best fellows in the world.
But what happened? He told me the story and answered my horrified questions. But there were things I wanted to know that he couldn't tell me. It was all confused. It was unbelievable. What actually had happened was only conjecture. Then someone claimed the manager's attention, and I went back to the garden. It was getting hot now, and I went up to my room. I was strangely shattered. It appeared that on one of the trips the captain took with him a Malay girl that he had been carrying on with, and I wondered if it was the one he had been so eager to see when I was on board. The other 3 had been against her coming. What did they want with a woman in the ship? It would spoil everything. But the captain insisted, and she came. I think they were all jealous of her. On that journey they didn't have the fun they generally had. When they wanted to play bridge, the skipper was dallying with the girl in his cabin. When they touched at a port and went ashore, the time seemed long to him till he could get back to her. He was crazy about her. It was the end of all their larks. The chief officer was more bitter against her than anybody. He was the captain's particular chum. They had been shipmates ever since they first came out from Holland. More than once high words passed between them on the subject of the captain's infatuation. Presently, those old friends spoke to one another only when their duties demanded it. It was the end of the good fellowship that had so long obtained between the 4 fat men. Things went from bad to worse. There was a feeling among the junior officers that something untoward was pending. Uneasiness. Tension. Then one night the ship was roused by the sound of a shot and the screams of the Malay girl. The supercargo and the chief engineer tumbled out of their bunks, and they found the captain, a revolver in his hand, at the door of the chief officer's cabin. He pushed past them and went on deck. They entered and found the chief officer dead, and the girl cowering behind the door. The captain had found them in bed together, and had killed the chief. How he had discovered what was going on didn't seem to be known, nor what was the meaning of the intrigue. Had the chief induced the girl to come to his cabin in order to get back on the captain? Or had she, knowing his ill will and anxious to placate him, lured him to become her lover? It was a mystery that would never be solved. A dozen possible explanations flashed across my mind. While the engineer and the supercargo were in the cabin, Horror-struck at the sight before them, another shot was heard. They knew at once what had happened. They rushed up the companion. The captain had gone to his cabin and blown his brains out. Then the story grew dark and enigmatic. Next morning the Malay girl was nowhere to be found, and when the second officer, who had taken command of the ship, reported this to the supercargo said, "She's probably jumped overboard. It's the best thing she could have done. Good riddance to bad rubbish." But one of the sailors on the watch, just before dawn, had seen the supercargo and the chief engineer carry something up on deck, a bulky package about the size of a native woman, look about them to see that they were unobserved, and drop it overboard. And it was said all over the ship that these two, to avenge their friends, had sought the girl out in her cabin and strangled her and flung her body into the sea. When the ship arrived at Macassar, they were arrested and taken to Batavia to be tried for murder. The evidence was flimsy, and they were acquitted. But all through the East Indies they knew that the supercargo and the chief engineer had executed justice on the trollop who had caused the death of the two men they loved. And thus ended the comic and celebrated friendship of the four fat Dutchmen.